Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Now we begin with Story 1. The Great Mound Builders, Foundations Beneath the Forest. Imagine you are walking through a dense Midwestern forest. The air is thick with humidity. Cicadas buzz in the distance. The trail you're following rises ever so slightly until, almost without realizing it, you're standing atop a massive earthen mound. Beneath your feet lies the evidence of a civilization that once bustled with life, trade, ritual, and architecture. But now, it's just grass and soil. Before there was Cahokia, before the massive monk's mound towered over thousands of thatched homes and ceremonial plazas, there were the mound builders. Their story is quieter than the empires of Europe or the dynasties of China, but it is not less important, and it certainly is not less human. The Eastern Woodlands before Cahokia. Centuries before Cahokia's zenith in the 12th century, native peoples were already building monumental earthen structures across the Mississippi Valley and Ohio River basin. These weren't just burial mounds, although many were. They were temples, gathering places, calendars, and cosmological symbols. The people who built them are today lumped into what archaeologists term the Archaic and later woodland periods spanning from 3000 BCE to around 900 CE. But we don't know their names. Not really. And we don't have written records. What we do have are tens of thousands of mounds, some meticulously shaped as animals, like the famous Serpent Mound in Ohio, and others built in geometric perfection, using only baskets, sticks, and human labor. These builders weren't wandering tribes. They were organized communities with division of labor, religious specialists, and knowledge passed through generations. Poverty Point, the blueprint of complexity. In what is now northeastern Louisiana, the archaeological site known as Poverty Point predates Cahokia by over 2,000 years. Built between 1700 and 1100 BCE, it contains massive concentric ridges, some nearly 6 feet tall and over 3/4 of a mile in diameter. These ridges surround a 70-foot-tall earthen mound and face a large plaza, echoing the designs that would one day define Cahokia. At Poverty Point, archaeologists have found evidence of long-distance trade: copper from the Great Lakes, soapstone from the Appalachians, and obsidian from the Rockies. This suggests a vast network of exchange and influence, a surprising level of sophistication for what most still assume were small, isolated tribal groups. This wasn't a city in the traditional sense, but it was something close. Perhaps a ceremonial center, occupied seasonally by thousands who gathered for trade and ritual. The effort required to shape that much earth implies not just engineering, but a shared purpose. Mound building as worldview. In Western civilization, we often associate progress with stone castles, cathedrals, pyramids. But for the native peoples of North America, earth was sacred. Mounds were not crude structures. They were sculpted landscapes, infused with meaning. Some were platform mounds, flat-topped and used to elevate elite residences or temples. Others were conical burial mounds, carefully layered with bodies, grave goods, and soils of symbolic colors. Still others were effigy mounds, shaped like birds, panthers, or serpents, often aligned with astronomical events. Mound building wasn't just practical, it was cosmological. Many mounds were aligned to the solstices, or cardinal directions, anchoring communities in both time and space. To build a mound was to express one's place in the universe. And yet, despite the significance of these earthworks, thousands have been destroyed, plowed under for farms, leveled for roads, or simply eroded away, undocumented and unnoticed. Hopewell and Adena, builders of legacy. The names Hopewell and Adena are archaeological labels, not tribal identities. These cultures flourished from around 1000 BCE to 400 CE across Ohio, Illinois, Indiana, and Kentucky. They built enormous ceremonial centers, with earthen enclosures forming perfect squares, circles, and octagons, some spanning hundreds of acres. Using only primitive tools, they crafted burial goods with exquisite care. Mica carvings, obsidian blades, copper ornaments, and pipes carved into animal shapes. Their network stretched from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes. Yet the reasons for the rise and fall of these cultures remain vague. Around 400 CE, the construction of mounds and geometric enclosures waned. The Hopewell tradition dissipated. Did environmental changes affect food supply? Did social systems shift? We may never fully know. Still, the legacy of the mound builders endured. In the fertile floodplains of the Mississippi Valley, new cultures emerged, cultures that remembered how to move the earth. The stage is set for Cahokia. By 700 CE, a new cultural horizon was forming. This period, termed the Mississippian, saw the development of more intensive agriculture, especially maize cultivation, and an increasing reliance on centralized leadership and ceremonial centers. The mound-building tradition not only survived, it evolved, and nowhere did it reach greater heights both literally and figuratively than at Cahokia. But Cahokia didn't emerge from nowhere. It stood on the shoulders of the Poverty Point engineers, the Hopewell artists, the Adena architects, and countless unnamed people who believed that moving earth could bring them closer to the cosmos. It's easy to look at the mounds and see dirt, but they are stories, some of the oldest in North America. Each basket of soil was placed with intention, part of a pattern we are only beginning to understand. And yet, the more we uncover, the more questions arise. Why were these mounds abandoned? What spiritual or societal forces led entire cultures to shift direction, sometimes almost overnight? What was it about Cahokia, this particular place, that allowed it to rise when so many others fell? When we left off, the mounds stretched like quiet sentinels across the eastern woodlands, built and rebuilt by generations who never carved their names into stone, but instead shaped the earth itself into monuments of memory. But by 700–800 CE, something shifted. What had once been scattered ceremonial centers and small agricultural villages began to coalesce into something much larger, more focused, more vertical. That something was Cahokia, the first true city in what is now the United States. But it didn't spring from the ground fully formed. Its story began, as many great stories do, with geography, climate, and corn. The land beneath Cahokia, a natural crossroads. Cahokia rose in the American bottom, a broad floodplain on the east side of the Mississippi River, just across from modern-day St. Louis. The land was flat, fertile, and bounded by rivers, not only the Mississippi, but also the Missouri and Illinois rivers, creating a natural hub for trade, communication, and agriculture. Rivers were the interstates of prehistoric North America. They carried canoes laden with goods, people, and ideas, and this spot, nestled where major waterways converged, was the ideal place for a cultural explosion. The soil here was rich, replenished by millennia of floods. A person with a digging stick could plant corn and harvest enough to feed a family with room to spare. Surplus food, more than anything, is what allows cities to exist. But geography alone doesn't explain why a city appears. After all, fertile land existed elsewhere. What made Cahokia different? The agricultural catalyst, corn becomes king. Though maize was introduced to the eastern woodlands centuries earlier, it wasn't until around 800 CE that it took on a central role in diets. Farming technologies improved, and yields increased. Maize, unlike nuts or hunted game, could be stored for long periods. That made it a kind of edible currency, a stable resource around which a whole new society could be built. Suddenly, villages could grow larger without starving. Leaders could store surplus grain and redistribute it in times of scarcity. This centralized control over food laid the foundation for complex hierarchies and social classes. But with abundance came inequality. Those who controlled the food often came to control the people. In the flat floodplains, platform mounds began to rise, each one elevating the homes and temples of a growing elite class above the homes of commoners. Cahokia wasn't just built on corn. It was built on the organization that corn made possible. Population boom. A city rises from the fields. By 1050 CE, Cahokia exploded in size. In less than a generation, it transformed from a regional center into a true city. Estimates suggest its population reached 15,000,000, with tens of thousands more in the surrounding countryside, larger than London at the same time. Why the sudden surge? Archaeologists point to a mysterious event called the Big Bang of Cahokian urbanism. Around 1050 CE, a massive reorganization occurred. Old neighborhoods were abandoned, and new ones were rapidly built in a planned, grid-like pattern. The central plaza was leveled. Monk's Mound began its largest expansion. Sacred wooden circles called woodhenges were erected nearby, likely to mark solstices and equinoxes. This wasn't just urban sprawl. It was intentional civic planning, on a scale not seen before in North America. Someone, or more likely, some group, had the authority to move people, realign infrastructure, and reshape the city to reflect a new cosmology. The effort required is staggering. Moving millions of cubic feet of earth by hand, without pack animals or wheels, takes not just labor but vision. And yet, Cahokia's skyline grew, mound by mound, plaza by plaza. Social structure and stratification. At the heart of Cahokia was Monk's Mound, a four-terraced platform mound 100 feet tall and covering more ground than the Great Pyramid of Giza. At its summit stood a massive structure, likely a temple or the residence of the ruling elite. This was not just a religious site. It was the nerve center of power. From this height, leaders could literally look down upon the city's commoners. Surrounding neighborhoods were organized with smaller mounds and rectangular houses, showing evidence of rank. Elite burials contained copper, marine shells, and engraved stone, while others were simple, sometimes mass graves with signs of violent death. There was a clear hierarchy, one likely reinforced by religion, ceremony, and spectacle. Periodic festivals, ritual games, and communal feasts helped create cohesion, but also reminded people who held power. A cosmological city, aligning earth and sky. Cahokia was not designed randomly. Its orientation shows remarkable astronomical alignment, particularly with solar events. The woodhenge circles, made from tall red cedar posts, functioned as solar calendars. Standing in the center on the morning of the summer solstice, the rising sun would appear directly above a marked post on the horizon. The city itself was aligned with cardinal directions, creating a symbolic order. East was associated with rebirth and power. Fittingly, Monk's Mound faced east. These alignments weren't just aesthetic. They were spiritual. They linked the human-built world to the cosmos, reinforcing the legitimacy of rulers who claimed to mediate between sky and earth. In this way, Cahokia wasn't just a place where people lived. It was a sacred landscape, engineered to reflect a cosmic order. Every post, mound, and path had meaning. Religious unity or fear. One of the biggest mysteries surrounding Cahokia is how such a large, diverse population was held together. The archaeological record shows people from as far away as the Great Lakes and the Gulf Coast living in the city. Did they come for opportunity, for protection, or were they drawn by religious devotion? Evidence suggests that pilgrimage may have been a factor. People came to Cahokia for festivals, rituals, and burials, but not all came voluntarily. In some burial mounds, mass graves of sacrificial victims have been found, often young women, sometimes interred with signs of violence or lack of ceremony. Whether these were captives or willing participants in religious rites is unknown, but their presence points to a city not just unified by faith but controlled by it. Religious spectacle, it seems. was both a source of inspiration and a tool of domination. A moment of pause. By 1100 CE, Cahokia was at its height a city of temples and astronomers, farmers and warriors, elite rulers and laborers. It stood as the largest urban center north of Mesoamerica, a cultural beacon in a continent largely dismissed by European history books as empty. But nothing lasts forever. Even as the city grew, signs of stress were already forming: environmental strain, social unrest, and shifting climate patterns. Beneath the grandeur of the mounds lay the seeds of uncertainty. What happens when a city built on surplus faces scarcity? What happens when the sky no longer aligns with the beliefs written into the very earth? The city of Cahokia did not fall in a dramatic blaze of conquest. There were no Roman legions at the gates, no Mongol siege engines, no disease-bearing galleons arriving from a distant shore at least, not yet. Instead, Cahokia faded, slowly, mysteriously, like the morning fog over the Mississippi, one moment present, the next dissolved into the trees and the sky. By 1350 CE, the once bustling metropolis had emptied out. Fields were abandoned. Mounds stood alone, silent in the clearing. The city vanished, but the questions remained. What went wrong? Signs of trouble: overuse, erosion, and exhaustion. Cahokia's success was built on agriculture, but agriculture is an agreement with the land and one that can be broken. With a population of over 15,000 in a relatively small region, intensive farming became a necessity. Forests were cleared for fields and fuel. The soil was tilled, year after year, without the benefit of rotation or fertilizers. The result: erosion. Sediment cores taken from nearby lakes show increased soil runoff beginning around the city's peak. The once rich earth, so perfect for maize, was washing away into rivers. As fields became less productive, food security faltered, and social structures that depended on surplus began to wobble. This was no sudden catastrophe, it was death by 1,000 cuts. The kind of slow decline so boring it's often left out of history. And yet, it might have been the most important kind. Water floods and the shifting climate. Nature is rarely content to remain stable, especially in the fertile floodplains of the Mississippi. Evidence from tree rings and sediment studies suggests that Cahokia experienced major flooding events in the 1200s, coinciding with broader climatic shifts tied to the Little Ice Age. Floods may have damaged farmland and homes. The climate also became cooler and wetter, shortening the growing season for maize and increasing unpredictability in harvests. Imagine living in a society that depends on the sky to behave. The sun needs to rise where it always has. The rains need to come when they're supposed to. When they don't, when crops fail and the rivers rise, it's not just a practical problem. It's a cosmic rupture. The entire belief system begins to fray. What happens when a sacred landscape no longer behaves as promised? Unrest in walls. Around 1200 CE, something changed in the layout of Cahokia. A massive palisade wall was built around the central precinct. This wall wasn't symbolic, it was defensive, over 2 miles long, reinforced with watchtowers and periodically rebuilt. A city that once welcomed pilgrims was now guarding itself. Why? There's no written record, but archaeological clues suggest internal unrest. A mass burial site known as Mound 72, previously thought to represent a single sacrificial event, actually contains multiple overlapping interments, some with signs of violent trauma. Nearby villages show signs of fortification. Scattered evidence hints at intergroup conflict, perhaps between competing elite lineages or between the ruling class and commoners. Social cohesion, once held together by ritual and surplus, was unraveling. Migration and diaspora. By 1300 CE, people began leaving Cahokia, not in a single exodus but gradually in waves. Over time, neighborhoods emptied. Construction halted. The sacred mounds, once the centerpieces of urban and spiritual life, were left untended, their edges softening with rain and time. Where did the people go? We cannot say for certain, but it's likely they joined or formed smaller communities elsewhere. Some may have migrated south and east, contributing to the rise of later Mississippian towns like Etowah in present-day Georgia, Moundville in Alabama, and Spiro in Oklahoma. Others likely blended into regional tribes whose descendants still live today, the Osage, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and others. The city dissolved, but the people survived. They carried their stories, their memories, and perhaps even their resentments. Cahokia was not a failure, it was a phase. Silence and erasure. For centuries, Cahokia was forgotten, at least by the world beyond. The mounds remained, of course. They're hard to miss, but they were misinterpreted. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European settlers and amateur historians believed they could not have been built by Native Americans. The idea that indigenous peoples could create complex societies with monumental architecture was dismissed. Instead, early archaeologists invented lost races. The mound builders were sometimes imagined as Phoenicians, Vikings, or even refugees from Atlantis. This was not ignorance, it was ideological erasure. To justify expansion, settlers needed to believe that the land had once belonged to a vanished people, not the tribes they were actively displacing. The mounds became relics of a convenient mythology. It wasn't until the 20th century that mainstream archaeology began to properly credit indigenous Americans with Cahokia's construction. But even today, few outside academic circles know its full story. The rediscovery and preservation. Monk's Mound, the largest at Cahokia, takes its name not from the native builders but from French Trappist monks who settled nearby in the early 1800s. They farmed its slopes without realizing what lay beneath. In time, the site became a curiosity, then a tourist attraction, and eventually, in 1982, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Today, visitors walk its steps and peer across the grassy fields where a city once stood. Archaeologists continue to unearth clues, post holes from wooden homes, fragments of pottery, ceremonial figurines, and the outline of once sacred circles. But much of Cahokia remains unexcavated. In part, this is due to limited resources. In part, its respect, many descendants of the Mississippians consider the mounds sacred and wish them to remain untouched. And so the earth keeps its secrets. Why it matters now. Cahokia's story is not one of collapse alone. It's a story of rise, of resilience, of experimentation in urban life without writing, without wheels, without stone. Its people built monuments visible from miles away. They tracked the stars. They traded with cultures thousands of miles distant. They governed, feasted, fought, and worshipped. They managed natural resources until they couldn't. In an age when we face our own ecological tipping points, when cities rise and choke and wonder how to survive, there's something profoundly human about Cahokia's arc. It reminds us that complexity isn't forever, that belief systems are fragile, that cities are organisms alive, growing, and eventually decaying. But it also reminds us that even in silence, stories endure. Somewhere beneath a St. Louis suburb, a child's toy lies in the soil clay shaped by hand, once bright with paint. It may never be found. It may not have a name, but it was held by someone who lived in the first American city, and in that there is something sacred. Story 2, City of the Sun, Cahokia's urban miracle. From a distance, it would have shimmered like a mirage. Rising from the flat floodplain, a massive earthen platform loomed over the fields. Broad plazas opened beneath it, ringed with thatched homes, ceremonial buildings, and wooden posts reaching skyward like sentinels. Smoke curled from cooking fires. Footpaths cut through cultivated plots. Children chased chickens. And high atop the mound, a lone structure caught the dawn's first light, aligned with a sun rising on a carefully chosen axis. This was Cahokia at its height, A city not of stone or marble, but of mud, wood, maize, and memory. A city with no written language, yet planned with architectural precision. A city without wheels, carts, or beasts of burden, yet filled with monumental buildings moved by human hands. It is perhaps the most improbable metropolis in North America's history, but it was real, and it was magnificent. An urban center without blueprints. Cahokia did not sprawl by accident. Beneath the surface of its modern-day ruins lies evidence of a city built according to a master plan. Archaeologists using aerial imaging, soil analysis, and ground-penetrating radar have uncovered the outlines of a city designed with intent, symmetry, and symbolic meaning. At the heart of the city was Monk's Mound, the largest earthen structure in the Western Hemisphere, covering over 14 acres at its base and rising nearly 100 feet into the air. The mound itself was built in 4 terraces, each carefully layered with different types of soil and clay, some transported from miles away. This wasn't just about elevation, it was ritual engineering. Each layer, each slope, each direction served a purpose. Directly in front of Monk's Mound stretched a vast central plaza, measuring about 50 acres, roughly the size of 35 football fields. This space was likely used for ceremonies, gatherings, games, and perhaps even markets. The surrounding neighborhoods fanned out in a grid-like pattern, suggesting an urban logic rare in pre-modern settlements. This wasn't just a big village. It was a true city and not a chaotic one. There was zoning, ceremonial districts, residential quarters, defensive structures, and infrastructural planning, all without metal tools or formal blueprints. Wood, earth, and labor, the materials of civilization. Without stone quarries or access to abundant hard rock, the builders of Cahokia used what they had, earth and wood. Thousands of tons of soil were moved by hand, in baskets, one load at a time, to construct over 120 mounds across the greater Cahokia site. Some mounds were platforms for elite homes or temples. Others were conical burial mounds, and still others served as ritual markers, perhaps tied to celestial events. Surrounding buildings were made from wattle and daub, woven wood lattices packed with mud and covered with thatched roofs. These homes were functional, adapted to the humid summers and cold winters of the Mississippi Valley. The construction was labor-intensive, but it was not disorganized. Archaeological strata suggest coordinated labor events, perhaps tied to festivals or community obligations. The effort required would have demanded not just leadership, but also belief. Why would thousands of people spend days hauling dirt unless they believed they were building something sacred? Woodhenge, aligning the city to the heavens. Near the western edge of Cahokia's core lies one of its most enigmatic features, Woodhenge. Discovered in the 1960s through aerial photography, this circular array of massive wooden posts functioned as an astronomical calendar. At least 5 versions of Woodhenge were constructed over time, each larger and more refined. The central post aligned with the rising sun on the summer solstice, while other posts marked the equinoxes and winter solstice. People would have gathered here at dawn, in silence or song, to watch the sun rise over specific mounds or temples, reaffirming the order of the cosmos. But Woodhenge was more than a calendar. It symbolized the connection between earth and sky, between the temporal and the eternal. In many native traditions, time is circular, and the seasons are sacred cycles. Woodhenge wasn't just a tool, it was a temple without walls. And its existence proves this. The people of Cahokia were watching the stars, tracking time, and orienting their lives to the heavens. Housing the masses, neighborhoods, and kin networks. Beyond the ceremonial core, Cahokia was filled with houses, thousands of them. These weren't random huts scattered in the fields. They were built in rows, often aligned with the city's cardinal layout, and clustered around courtyards or family compounds. Most houses were rectangular, about 20 feet long, with clay floors, hearths, and storage pits. Some had central posts for hanging tools or cooking pots. They were grouped in ways that suggest extended kinship networks, families living together, perhaps sharing resources, child-rearing duties, and communal work. Trash pits nearby yield rich data. Fragments of pottery, stone tools, corn cobs, bones of deer and fish, and beads or ornamental pieces. These are the whispers of everyday life, the things that mattered to ordinary people. One surprising detail is the presence of diverse pottery styles, hinting at cultural mixing. People from distant regions had come to Cahokia and brought their traditions with them. It was not a monoculture, but a mosaic. Economy without currency, trade, surplus, and redistribution. Cahokia's economy lacked coins or formal currency, but it was vibrant. Trade goods from hundreds of miles away have been found in the city. Marine shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian and pipestone from the Rockies, chert and mica from the Appalachians. These goods weren't just decoration, they held ceremonial, spiritual, or political value. Elite burials contained beads, effigy pipes, engraved tablets, and other prestige items, suggesting that Cahokia had a class system with status indicators. But how did the economy function? Most likely, it was based on reciprocal exchange and redistribution. Surplus crops, especially corn, were collected by elites and redistributed during feasts, ceremonies, or times of need. Such systems built loyalty and legitimacy. The leader gave you corn in winter. You hauled dirt for his mound in spring. This wasn't capitalism. It was a ritual economy, one in which obligation, gift-giving, and status shaped transactions. Public rituals and social cohesion. Cahokia was not held together by force alone. Social cohesion was reinforced through public rituals, performances, and festivals. Archaeologists have found large open areas and game courts. One such game was chunky, played with a disc-shaped stone rolled across the ground and spears thrown to predict where it would stop. It was more than a pastime, it was a ceremonial competition, perhaps tied to social status, war preparation, or diplomacy. Public feasts also played a role. Massive cooking pits, bone piles, and serving vessels suggest gatherings of hundreds or thousands. These events weren't just for food, they were ritual reaffirmations of order. In times of uncertainty, the shared meal is often the glue of community. But such cohesion required balance. Too much power at the top and resentment brews. Too much disorder and the structure collapses. Cahokia, for a time, managed that balance. What made Cahokia possible? Was it maize, geography, a charismatic leader, religion, climate? The answer is all of these and something more. Cahokia represents a rare convergence of ecological abundance, spiritual vision, social innovation, and geographic advantage. It was a place where belief, labor, and leadership aligned for a few brilliant centuries. But behind the majesty was always fragility. The same systems that allowed Cahokia to rise would make it vulnerable to even small disruptions. As we look back, we are left with a series of open questions. Could Cahokia have sustained itself longer? Were there factions and rebellions hidden beneath its orderly surface? And how much of its story is still waiting, quietly beneath our feet? From the bustling neighborhoods to the silent summit of Monk's Mound, Cahokia functioned not only as a city, but as a center of cosmic order. Every mound, every wooden post, every grain of maize stored in its granaries had a place within a sacred design, a world built to mirror both heaven and hierarchy. This wasn't just a city with spiritual elements. It was a sacred city, built on principles of power, ceremony, and obligation. And at its heart, someone or something held it all together. Who ruled Cahokia? And how did they maintain control over such a vast, diverse, and growing population? The divine center, Monk's Mound and the ruler-priest. Monk's Mound wasn't just the largest structure in Cahokia, it was the axis of authority, the stage upon which spiritual and political power converged. At its top once stood a massive wooden building, likely a temple or the home of the city's ruling elite. From this perch, one could see the entire central precinct. It was the ultimate seat of visibility and symbolism. Just as European kings built castles to loom over their subjects, Cahokia's elite physically rose above the people, separated by elevation, ritual, and architectural grandeur. The ruler was likely more than just a political figure. In many Mississippian societies, the chief, or great son, was considered a divine intermediary, a being who bridged the human and spiritual worlds. His presence was not just influential, it was cosmologically necessary. This figure may have performed rituals tied to the agricultural calendar, ensuring the sun's favor, the rain's return, and the land's fertility. His failure to do so could bring famine or misfortune. Thus, his legitimacy was constantly under scrutiny, tested not just by rivals but by the forces of nature. Sacrifice and power, the evidence of Mound 72. Just a short distance from Monk's Mound lies Mound 72, a seemingly modest rise in the earth that has revealed one of the most haunting discoveries in North American archaeology. Beneath its layers, archaeologists uncovered a series of burials unlike anything else at the site. Most significant was the central interment, a man laid out on a bed of 20,000 marine shell beads, arranged in the shape of a falcon or birdman figure. This birdman burial has been interpreted as that of a high-status individual, possibly even the city's founder or a divine ruler. Surrounding him were dozens of sacrificial victims, young women laid out in rows, and others, both male and female, buried hastily, some with signs of trauma. In total, over 270 burials were found in this single mound. This was not random violence. It was ritualized death, performed to solidify the ruler's divine status or to mark a moment of monumental transition. Human sacrifice, while horrifying to modern sensibilities, was a form of spiritual and political expression in many ancient cultures. In Cahokia, it may have served as both tribute and threat. Ceremony as control, binding the masses through ritual. Cahokia's rulers didn't rely solely on force or fear. They employed ritual and spectacle tools more enduring and often more effective than coercion. Large-scale ceremonies served to reinforce social bonds, elevate elite status, and reaffirm cosmic alignment. The construction of mounds, the celebration of solstices, the playing of ritual games like chunky, and the sharing of food during festivals all played roles in maintaining social cohesion. One can imagine thousands gathered in the grand plaza on the longest day of the year, watching the sun rise between aligned posts of wood hen. Chants, drums, smoke, offerings, every element reinforcing the idea that the world was as it should be. In such settings, the ruler priest could appear not as a man, but as a conduit of celestial forces. The crowd's awe was not just for him, but for what he represented. Polity without paper, how Cahokia governed. Without writing, how did Cahokia function as a political entity? Control was likely exercised through networks of loyalty, reciprocity, and religious ideology. Leaders granted access to resources, food, sacred knowledge, trade goods in exchange for service, obedience, and ritual participation. Communication may have been maintained through ritual specialists who traveled between outposts, bringing instructions, calendars, or sacred items. Authority radiated outward from Cahokia's ceremonial center into the surrounding villages and satellite sites, some directly controlled, others allied through kinship or shared belief systems. There's no evidence of codified laws or standing armies, but the presence of defensive walls and elite residences suggest a centralized hierarchy capable of organizing large-scale labor and enforcing decisions. This was soft power, backed when necessary by the symbolism of sacrifice and the ever-present weight of sacred expectation. Women's status and the hidden layers of power. While most high-status burials in Cahokia appear to be male, women's roles were far from secondary. Some burials of young women, particularly those found in Mound 72, suggest not only ritual importance but potentially dynastic or symbolic significance. In many indigenous cultures, clan lineage passed through the mother's line, and women held key roles in managing food storage, land inheritance, and domestic economies. The presence of high-status female figurines and artifacts suggests that female spiritual figures, or priestesses, may have played significant roles in ritual life. We may never know their names or exact titles, but the evidence hints at a society where power was multifaceted and not limited to one gender. Trade and influence. Cahokia as a cultural beacon. Cahokia's influence extended far beyond its borders. Sites as far away as Wisconsin, Georgia, Oklahoma, and Arkansas show signs of Cahokian goods, architecture, and ceremonial styles. The spread of shell ornaments, copper plates, pottery motifs, and mound construction patterns suggest a Mississippian cultural sphere. Some of these were likely part of tributary networks, others products of cultural emulation. Either way, Cahokia became a beacon of identity and prestige. To align with Cahokia was to participate in a broader sacred order. The city's rulers, then, were not just lords of a physical space, they were arbiters of meaning, shaping how entire regions viewed time, nature, and human obligation. Cracks beneath the surface. Despite its magnificence, evidence of stress begins to appear around 1200 CE. The Grand Palisade Wall is rebuilt multiple times, suggesting threats from within or without. Burial patterns shift, and signs of nutritional stress appear in skeletons, especially among the lower classes. Wood resources dwindle, and deforestation intensifies. New mound construction slows, indicating a decline in labor mobilization. Social inequality may have widened, and the sacred promises once offered by Cahokia's elite of order, abundance, and cosmic favor may have begun to ring hollow. And when the sun no longer rose exactly where it should, or when the maize withered in the fields, faith faltered. A world built on belief. Cahokia teaches us that cities are not just collections of homes and markets. They are ideas made real, belief systems translated into architecture, ritual, and law. For a time, Cahokia thrived not just because of its rivers, crops, or walls, but because its people believed in it. They believed in the ruler on the mound, the circle in the field, the grain in the ground, and the rising sun over the wooden post. But belief is fragile. It requires constant renewal. And once that renewal failed, whether from within or by external force, the very idea of Cahokia may have begun to fade. What happens to a city when the sacred becomes ordinary? What remains when a people no longer agree on where the sun should rise? The height of Cahokia's power, its massive mounds, its solar-aligned temples, its bustling neighborhoods and broad ceremonial plazas lasted perhaps 2 centuries. Long in human years, short in civilizational time. But by the early 1300s, the city's grandeur had begun to dim. And by 1350, Cahokia was largely abandoned. The metropolis that had once stood as the most populous and complex urban center in North America, north of Mexico, was now silent, left to the grasses, the forests, and the floodwaters. Why did it end? The answer is neither simple nor singular. Instead, it lies in a web of interwoven causes: ecological, social, and spiritual. A fragile ecosystem cracks. Cahokia's setting, the Mississippi floodplain, was both a blessing and a curse. The same rivers that brought fertility and trade also brought floods and instability. Evidence from sediment cores taken near the city indicates a major flood event around 1200–1250 CE. While Cahokia had always lived with water, this event was different, more destructive, longer lasting and deeply disruptive to both farming and settlement. Crops were drowned, homes were destroyed, sacred landscapes were altered. At the same time, archaeobotanical evidence shows that intensive maize agriculture, the foundation of the city's food system, was reaching its ecological limits. Soil degradation, erosion, and deforestation were mounting. The land, once generous, was beginning to fail. And when food becomes scarce in a society that depends on surplus to maintain political and religious authority, the consequences ripple outward. Internal conflict in the wall. Around the same period, Cahokia's leadership made a striking choice. They fortified the central precinct with a palisade and earthen wall topped with sharpened wooden posts, enclosing the sacred core and elite residences. The wall was not symbolic. It was militarized, rebuilt multiple times, and reinforced with bastions at regular intervals. This was a city under threat, but from whom? No records survive to answer, but the possibilities are clear. Internal uprisings from the lower classes, frustrated by growing inequality and food scarcity. Factional conflict between elite lineages, vying for control over ritual and resources. External pressure from rival polities or displaced groups in the region. Violence doesn't always leave scars on bones. Sometimes, it lingers only in the hurried construction of walls, the sudden abandonment of neighborhoods, and the silence that follows. The collapse of faith. Cahokia was not only a city of structures and systems, it was a cosmological vision made physical. Its grid, mounds, and ceremonial calendar were meant to mirror a divine order. The people did not just live in Cahokia, they believed in it. But belief must be renewed. When the sun no longer rose on the expected solstice marker, when floods erased sacred boundaries, when priests failed to predict or prevent misfortune, faith eroded. Rulers who had once been seen as divine intermediaries may have been reinterpreted as frauds or failures. Rituals meant to bring balance now seemed hollow. Ceremonies that once unified the masses may have become contentious or even divisive. In the end, when the sacred order fails, people walk away. Migration and memory. Archaeological evidence shows that after Cahokia's decline, populations dispersed throughout the region. The Mississippi Valley did not empty, but its center shifted. Smaller Mississippian towns and villages thrived elsewhere. Etowah in Georgia, Moundville in Alabama, Spiro in Oklahoma, and others took on new prominence. The descendants of Cahokia's builders didn't vanish. They adapted, migrated, and reformed their societies, often with more local governance and less monumental construction. The memory of Cahokia may have lived on not in stone or text, but in oral traditions, in pottery designs, in ritual songs sung around fires far from the old city. And yet, without writing, the precise details of the city's fall were lost, transformed into myth, or forgotten entirely. The mounds remained, but for centuries they were misunderstood. Colonial erasure and the myth of the vanished race. When Europeans arrived in the Mississippi Valley in the 17th century, they encountered tribes with rich cultures, complex political systems, and long-standing ties to the land. But they did not recognize Cahokia. The city's ruins were overgrown. The mounds were covered in grass, mistaken for hills or natural formations. Later, as American settlers moved westward, they encountered these earthen remnants and assumed they could not have been built by Native Americans. This belief gave rise to the mound builder myth, the claim that the mounds were created by a lost race of superior people, perhaps descended from the Bible, Egypt, or Atlantis. It was a convenient story, one that erased indigenous achievement and justified dispossession. For over a century, the myth persisted, taught in textbooks and promoted by amateur antiquarians. Only in the 20th century did scientific archaeology begin to restore Cahokia's rightful place in American history. But the damage had been done. The mounds were looted, plowed under, built over. The bones of ancestors were scattered in museum drawers, and a civilization that once rivaled medieval London was reduced to a footnote if it appeared at all. A city remembered, a future reclaimed. Today, Cahokia is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, one of the few in the United States that commemorates indigenous history. Monk's Mound has been preserved. Interpretive centers and archaeological research continue, yet most Americans have never heard of it. Schools rarely teach it. The city's history is not woven into the national mythos, and so the silence continues. But for those who walk its grounds, climb its mound, or stand in the center of Woodhenge at sunrise, there is still something powerful in the earth, a presence, a whisper. And in recent years, descendant communities including the Osage Nation and other tribes have begun to reclaim this history, offering new interpretations, ceremonial returns, and calls for broader recognition. Because Cahokia is not just the past, it is part of an ongoing indigenous present, a legacy that continues to shape identity, sovereignty, and belonging. The lasting lessons of Cahokia. Cahokia challenges us. It asks, what does it mean to build a city without writing, wheels, or metal, yet with vision, labor, and shared belief? It reveals that urban complexity is not unique to Europe, the Middle East, or Asia. That North America had civilizations of equal scale, innovation, and humanity. It reminds us that greatness is not always preserved in stone. Sometimes it is buried under a highway, or reduced to a line on a map, or forgotten entirely until someone digs carefully and listens. In the silence of Cahokia, we hear the echoes of a people who once aligned their lives to the stars, who gathered by the thousands to build, to feast, to remember, who lived in a city of the sun until the sun no longer rose where it was expected. Story 3. The Woodhenge Chronicles, Time, Stars, and Sacred Spaces. As dawn approaches on the spring equinox, the eastern horizon begins to glow. Standing alone in a wide, open field ringed by evenly spaced wooden posts, a figure waits. The earth is cold, the air is silent, and then it happens. The sun crests the edge of the world, perfectly aligned with a single post, a vertical marker rising from the frost-covered grass like a finger pointing to the heavens. A soft murmur begins among the gathered people. Another year has begun. The world, it seems, is still in order. This moment happened more than 900 years ago, and it likely happened not once, but dozens, perhaps hundreds of times, witnessed by people in Cahokia's Woodhenge, one of the most remarkable and misunderstood features of the North American archaeological record. In this story, we explore how indigenous peoples built monuments not just for the earth, but for time itself, how sacred space was shaped by celestial rhythms, and how the rising and setting sun became a form of power. Rediscovery, the hidden circle beneath the cornfields. For centuries, the Woodhenge at Cahokia lay buried beneath soil and speculation. It wasn't until 1961, during a routine aerial survey of the area west of Monk's Mound, that archaeologist Warren Witry noticed a faint ring of post holes in the soil. At first, they seemed unremarkable, simply dark stains in the earth, but their perfect circular formation and their alignment with solstitial points on the horizon changed everything. Witry coined the term Woodhenge in reference to England's Stonehenge, and while the materials differed, wood instead of stone, the principles were strikingly similar. The posts were red cedar, a tree considered sacred in many native traditions. They were carefully placed, some as much as 400 feet apart, forming circles with up to 72 posts in total. The largest of these circles measured nearly 410 feet in diameter, requiring extraordinary precision and planning. These were not random constructions. They were calendrical tools, cosmological markers, and ceremonial centers, measuring time with shadows and light. Before clocks, before calendars, before writing, humans measured time using the sky. In Cahokia, this knowledge was encoded in architecture. The wood-hinged circles were designed so that specific posts aligned with sunrises and sunsets on key astronomical dates, the winter and summer solstices, and the spring and autumn equinoxes. A person standing at the central observation post, likely a priest, ruler, or astronomer, could determine the day of the year based on where the sun rose relative to the circle's edge. This wasn't just useful, it was sacred. The movement of the sun told people when to plant, when to harvest, when to celebrate, and when to mourn. It marked cycles of fertility, death, and renewal. And most importantly, it reinforced the idea of cosmic order. If the sun rose where it should, then all was well. If not, the implications were profound. Why circles? Sacred geometry and symbolism. Circles are among the most ancient symbols of unity, infinity, and wholeness. For many native cultures, they represent the cyclical nature of life seasons, moons, births, and deaths, all recurring in endless repetition. The circular form of Cahokia's woodhenge was not just functional, it was symbolic, it mirrored the circular sky, moving in predictable arcs, the circle of the sun, ever rising and setting, the communal fire ring, around which families gathered. The circle placed everyone equidistant from the center, reinforcing spiritual equality, even in a hierarchical society. The central post wasn't just for observation. It was the axis mundi, the world's center, the point through which cosmic energy flowed. To stand at the circle's center was to stand at the center of the universe. Construction without blueprints, engineering the circle. How did Cahokians build such perfect circles, without metal tools, written instructions, or surveying equipment? Modern experimental archaeology offers clues. A large post would be driven into the ground to serve as the central pivot. A rope or vine, cut to the desired radius, could be stretched and rotated, marking the circumference with stakes or charcoal. This method, simple but effective, yields remarkably accurate circles. And in Cahokia's case, the builders did more than get the shape right, they got the angles of the solstice and equinox alignments precisely correct, an achievement requiring long-term observation of the sun's movement and careful integration of data over years, if not decades. This was science in the service of ceremony, a community endeavor that fused astronomy, labor, and belief. Ritual life in the circle. Woodhenge was not merely a calendar, it was a theater for ritual. Though few organic artifacts survive, the placement of charcoal, ash, and animal bones near post holes suggests that feasts or offerings may have been part of the events held here. The timing of these rituals, especially on equinoxes and solstices, would have imbued them with seasonal and spiritual meaning. Imagine the scene. A cold morning on the winter solstice, with the community gathered in heavy furs, watching as firelight dances across the posts. A priest raises a hand as the sun touches the horizon, aligned with a sacred marker. Songs begin. Corn is burned in offering. Stories are told. The new solar cycle begins. These weren't just festivals. They were acts of renewal, affirming that the world still worked, that time was still turning. Woodhenge and social order. Who had access to these rituals? Who stood inside the circle? There's evidence to suggest that the woodhenge may have been restricted or tiered in access. The alignments were visible from specific vantage points, suggesting that not everyone had the same experience of the event. The central post, after all, only lines up properly when viewed from the design position. This reinforces the idea that control of astronomical knowledge was a form of power. The person who could predict the equinox could also predict the rains. The person who could call the seasons could command allegiance. In this way, woodhenge was a political tool as well as a sacred one. It cemented the ruler-priest's position as both leader and cosmological interpreter. It was not just science, it was sovereignty through astronomy. Multiple circles, evolution over time. Interestingly, Cahokia's woodhenge was not a single structure. At least 5 overlapping circles have been identified, each slightly different in size and orientation. This suggests that the site evolved over time, possibly reflecting new dynasties or religious interpretations, refinements in astronomical observation, shifts in ritual priorities or population needs. Each new circle may have represented a renewal of vision, a fresh attempt to center the cosmos, or perhaps they mark rival factions, each asserting its own claim to the divine alignment. We may never know the exact reasons, but the multiplicity of circles reminds us that even sacred science is not static. It changes, adapts, and is contested. A forgotten clock in the earth. When Cahokia declined in the 14th century, so too did its wood hinges. The posts, once tall and red, rotted and fell, reclaimed by soil and memory. Without caretakers, the alignments no longer made sense. The rituals faded. The circle closed. For centuries, the field lay quiet. Farmers plowed it, unaware of the calendar beneath. The sun still rose on the solstice, but no one watched it from the center. The posts were gone. The knowledge slept. And yet even now, when archaeologists rebuild the posts at the reconstructed woodhenge west of Monk's Mound, the alignments still work. The sun still rises where it should. Time, it seems, remembers. But who was the last person to stand in the original circle, watching the sunrise? Did they know it was the final ceremony? Or did they believe, as always, that the next year would come? As the morning light passed through the circle of red cedar posts, it didn't just signal the solstice or the turning of the seasons, it validated a worldview. At Cahokia, astronomy wasn't an isolated science, and woodhenge wasn't just a primitive observatory. These were tools of governance, instruments of ideology, and anchors for a community's cosmic faith. In this section, we continue our exploration of woodhenge not as a static monument, but as an active center of authority, scientific observation, and sacred legitimacy. We consider how the act of watching the sky shaped politics on the ground, and how measuring time became a way of measuring order itself. The priest astronomer, interpreting the sky for the people. The figure who stood at the center of woodhenge during its alignments may have been more than a priest. More than an elite, he or she may have functioned as the calendar keeper, the ritual timekeeper, and perhaps even the voice of the divine. Without clocks or mechanical devices, communities had to depend on observers of nature, those who could track the movement of the sun, the stars, the moon. In Cahokia, this role may have been institutionalized into a priesthood or class of elite specialists. These individuals likely trained for years, learning not only the mechanics of solstices and equinoxes, but also their symbolic meanings, ritual protocols, and political applications. Imagine the awe of a society watching a designated individual declare, "The sun will rise between these posts on the shortest day of the year." And then it does. In a world without scientific explanations as we understand them, this accuracy seemed supernatural. Such predictive power became a foundation for trust, control, and leadership. From sky to ceremony, codifying the sacred calendar. The woodhenge alignments likely formed the backbone of a ceremonial calendar. Just as ancient civilizations in Egypt and Mesoamerica aligned their buildings with the sun, Cahokians too shaped their year around celestial events. While no written record survives, patterns in architecture and landscape suggest seasonal rituals organized around. Spring equinox, marking renewal, planting, and the ceremonial start of the agricultural year. Summer solstice, a time of abundance, leadership celebration, and perhaps initiations. Autumn equinox, harvest rituals, ancestral remembrance, redistribution of goods. Winter solstice, the symbolic death and rebirth of the sun, potentially a time of both fear and hope. These events would have provided ritual structure to daily life, acting as milestones for collective memory and identity. They would also mark the appropriate times for mound building, feasting, marriage, diplomacy, or even war. To know the sky's rhythm was to know when to act and when to wait. Alignments beyond Woodhen, a city tuned to the cosmos. Cahokia's use of celestial alignment wasn't limited to Woodhenge. The entire city was oriented according to cardinal directions, with Monk's Mound facing east, toward the rising sun. Other mounds appear to have astronomical orientations, possibly connected to solstitial or lunar cycles. Even burials were carefully placed. In some cases, the heads of the deceased faced certain directions, aligning their spiritual journey with cosmic order. These choices were not random. They reflected a worldview in which space, time, and power were integrated. To live in Cahokia was to live in a sacred geometry, a designed environment that mirrored the movements of the sky and the dictates of the spirit world. Cosmic order and social hierarchy. In Cahokia, the cosmos didn't just determine the seasons, it justified the social structure. The alignment of Woodhen, the rise of the sun, the presence of solstice markers all affirmed that the world was as it should be, and that those at the top of the mound were there for a reason. This was cosmic legitimacy, the idea that social order was not just a human invention, but a reflection of natural law. As long as the rituals were performed correctly, and the sun behaved as expected, the city was protected, the crops would grow, and the ancestors were pleased. The elite rulers, priests, astronomers were custodians of this balance, and their authority was tied directly to their perceived connection with the celestial realm. But if the alignments failed, if the sunrise missed its mark, if droughts or floods came unbidden, then doubt crept in. The psychological power of precision. Consider this: you are a farmer in Cahokia. You don't read or write. You don't keep time with a calendar. But every year on the same day, you walk with your family to the great circle of posts. You wait in the cold, and just as the priest predicted, the sun rises exactly where he said it would. That moment stays with you. It validates not only your religious belief, but your confidence in the society you're part of, your faith in the leadership, your place in a vast, intelligible cosmos. Now imagine the opposite. The priest declares a date, people gather. The sun rises but off-center, misaligned, disjointed. Whispers begin, questions rise. Was the priest wrong? Has the balance been upset? Are the spirits angry? In this way, accuracy in alignment was more than astronomy, it was psychological reinforcement. A misstep in celestial prediction could unravel social trust, while a successful one fortified it. The wooden bones of memory. Woodhenge's material cedar posts were chosen not only for durability, but for spiritual meaning. Cedar is aromatic, resistant to decay, and widely viewed in native cultures as a purifier, used in ceremonies to ward off evil and connect with the sacred. But even cedar rots. Within decades, the original Woodhenge structures would have decayed. Posts would lean, fall, disappear. Unless maintained and rebuilt, the alignments would no longer function. And as the years passed, knowledge may have been lost, priests died without successors, and ceremonies forgotten. The physical decay of the posts likely mirrored a spiritual decay, an erosion of confidence, a thinning of the cosmic bond. Woodhenge wasn't built to last forever. It was meant to be renewed. Its deterioration may have been one of the first signs that Cahokia's time was ending. Echoes across the continent. Cahokia's Woodhenge was not unique. Across the Mississippian world, from Georgia to Oklahoma, evidence of wood circles, sun calendars, and solstice markers has been found. These were not copies, but shared traditions, elements of a widespread cosmology in which the sun, the earth, and human ritual formed a triad of meaning. Each circle reflected its community's relationship with time. Each post was a story, and each alignment a moment where heaven and earth briefly met. But what did it feel like to stand in that circle knowing the year would begin again, if the sun rose true? And what did it feel like when, one year it did? Woodhenge stood for more than timekeeping. It was a visible expression of belief, a living structure that brought the cosmos down to earth. It gathered people, affirmed power, and measured the passage of seasons. And yet, like all things bound to time, Woodhenge itself began to decay. Slowly, silently. By the early 14th century, the great cedar posts had begun to lean. Some were no longer standing. The horizon no longer aligned precisely with the markers. The once reliable signals of sunrises and sunsets became ambiguous, uncertain. And with that uncertainty came something new, disruption. When the sun misaligns. To understand the collapse of sacred timekeeping, we must first imagine what it felt like to trust it. In a society so deeply attuned to the rhythms of the sun, a failure of alignment wasn't just a technical error, it was a spiritual event. For a civilization whose ruler's legitimacy was tied to the calendar and to the renewal of the seasons, even a small miscalculation had profound consequences. It may not have happened all at once. A cloudy solstice, a misaligned sunrise, a weak harvest that followed the beginning of doubt. Perhaps the calendar had been handed down incorrectly. Perhaps the wrong priest had been chosen, or perhaps the gods were withdrawing their favor. In oral societies, belief is reinforced through successful repetition. But when the visible signs no longer confirm the story, it is not only ritual that weakens. The very fabric of social cohesion begins to fray. The end of ritual time. As Cahokia's infrastructure faltered, its fields overfarmed, its woodlands stripped, its population's thinning, Woodhenge fell into disuse. The last circle, built near the end of the city's heyday, may have functioned briefly before being abandoned entirely. The posts rotted and fell. The central viewing platform disappeared. The precise calculations that once marked solstices and equinoxes were lost to memory, perhaps gradually, perhaps suddenly. And once that happened, the community lost its shared clock. There was no longer a central place to gather for the new year, no sunrise to sanctify the growing season. The calendar drifted, and with it, the ritual structure of life. Without Woodhenge functioning, time itself became unmoored. Astronomy and identity. What happens to a people when they can no longer predict the turning of the world? In Cahokia, the answer may have been fragmentation. With no clear authority to set the calendar, regional leaders may have emerged. Factions could have created rival rituals, differing interpretations of solstices, competing ceremonies. The loss of temporal unity would have led to political disunity. And without the grand public rituals that once brought thousands together in shared purpose, the city's people may have turned inward, forming smaller communities or leaving altogether. The central ritual identity of Cahokia, once anchored in celestial regularity, had unraveled. A city forgotten, a circle reclaimed. For centuries after its abandonment, Cahokia's Woodhenge lay beneath layers of soil and grass. Farmers plowed over the fields. Roads were built. The alignments became meaningless to those who came later. And yet, in 1961, when archaeologists uncovered the dark stains of the post holes, a new kind of memory began. Today, a reconstructed Woodhenge stands west of Monk's Mound. Built using cedar posts set in the original locations, it marks the spot where sunrises still align, just as they did 900 years ago. Each year on the spring and fall equinoxes, visitors gather at dawn. They stand in silence, and once again, the sun rises between the posts just as it was meant to. It's no longer about governing a city or controlling a people, but it still inspires something similar to awe, something like reverence. The power of remembering. We often talk about civilizations in terms of what they leave behind: stone walls, empires, texts, monuments. Cahokia left none of those in the traditional sense. No palaces, no scrolls, no carved statues. But it did leave circles in the earth, carefully aligned to the sun, and that's something rare. In its way, Cahokia's Woodhenge tells us that science can be sacred, that time can be measured through collective faith, that architecture can shape belief, even when it's made of nothing more than wood and dirt, and that long after a people are gone, their understanding of the world may still live in the angle of a shadow, the rise of the sun, or the curve of a forgotten circle. A sacred geometry interrupted. Woodhenge was not just a structure, it was an idea made visible. It asked its builders and users to believe that the universe had order, and that they could find their place within it not by dominating the world, but by observing it carefully, marking its changes, and celebrating its return. That is a form of humility not often seen in monumental architecture, not power over the world, but partnership with it. And perhaps that's what makes Woodhenge so quietly profound. It wasn't meant to last forever. It was meant to be used, rebuilt, and then released like breath or seasons or time itself. Somewhere beneath the soil, the original posts are still there, gone but not erased, aligned to the same sun that still rises each morning whether we watch or not. Story 4. The Mississippian Network, Rivers, Trade, and Influence. If you stood atop Monk's Mound at the height of Cahokia's influence and looked to the horizon, the city must have seemed endless. But beyond the palisades, beyond the neat rows of houses and the earth-packed avenues, another structure connected Cahokia to the rest of the continent, invisible, fluid, and alive. This structure was not built with mud or wood. It was made of rivers. From the Mississippi to the Ohio, the Missouri to the Arkansas, waterways formed the arteries of the Mississippian world. These rivers linked peoples across thousands of miles, transporting goods, ideas, and beliefs. They formed a trade network so vast and consistent that even isolated settlements on the fringes of the continent bore signs of Cahokia's touch. In this story, we explore the Mississippian network, a system not only of economics, but of cultural transmission, environmental adaptation, and subtle imperialism. It was the infrastructure beneath the infrastructure, and the key to how Cahokia rose and how it maintained its reach. The river as superhighway. Before railroads or interstates, before maps were even drawn, rivers were the highways of North America. They required no construction, no maintenance, just a knowledge of their moods and routes. And the central Mississippi River basin offered the perfect convergence. The Mississippi River flowed north to south, connecting the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. The Illinois River, just to the northeast, offered passage toward the Great Lakes. The Missouri River, flowing from the west, opened connections deep into the plains. The Ohio River, just downstream, led eastward, branching through the interior of Appalachia. At the hub of all these routes sat Cahokia. This was no accident. The city's location allowed it to intercept, redistribute, and control the flow of goods and people. In modern terms, it would be like placing your capital city at the busiest crossroads of a continent. But instead of toll booths or checkpoints, Cahokia used ritual, reputation, and trade goods to influence those who passed through. Goods on the move, a continental marketplace. Excavations at Cahokia and surrounding Mississippian sites have uncovered a surprising diversity of materials. These goods, some transported over hundreds of miles, include copper from the Great Lakes, hammered into ornaments, tools, and ceremonial plates; marine shell from the Gulf Coast, often carved into beads, gorgets, and ceremonial discs; obsidian and volcanic glass from the Rockies, used in cutting tools and ritual objects; chert and flint from Texas and Illinois, shaped into projectile points and knives; mica from the Appalachian Mountains, cut into reflective sacred shapes. None of these materials are native to Cahokia, yet they appear there in abundance, often concentrated in elite burials or ritual contexts. This distribution tells us something critical. Control of exotic goods conferred social power. To own shell beads or copper plates was not just decorative, it was symbolic. These items served as currency in a world without coins, marking one's status, connections, and possibly spiritual favor. How did trade work without markets or money? In Mississippian society, there was no concept of a stock exchange, no banks, no formalized currency. Trade occurred through embedded exchange systems woven into kinship, diplomacy, pilgrimage, and ritual obligations. Goods moved in several ways. Reciprocal gift exchange. Leaders or families would give high-status items as part of negotiations or alliances, expecting equivalent offerings in the future. Ritual redistribution. During festivals or ceremonies, elites at centers like Cahokia would distribute trade goods to followers or neighboring groups, buying loyalty with beads and copper. Pilgrimage and feasting. Visitors drawn to Cahokia for major events may have brought gifts and carried new items home, spreading material culture as they traveled. Long-distance specialist traders. While not merchants in a modern sense, certain individuals or families may have specialized in maintaining trade routes and knowledge of geography and diplomacy. In this system, goods were never just material, they were tied to relationships, cosmology, and prestige. The Spiro Connection, Cahokia's southern reach. Hundreds of miles to the southwest, in what is now eastern Oklahoma, lies the site of Spiro, one of the most significant Mississippian mound centers after Cahokia. At Spiro, archaeologists found a burial chamber beneath a mound filled with stunning objects, engraved shell plaques, copper plates, delicate textiles, and elaborate headdresses. Many of these items bear stylistic and symbolic similarities to Cahokia, particularly the so-called birdman motif found in both sites. But Spiro was not a satellite. It had its own power, culture, and ceremonial practices. Still, the shared iconography and goods suggest a deep cultural exchange, or perhaps mutual recognition within a shared religious framework. The river routes between Cahokia and Spiro are direct. Goods, ideas, and possibly people moved along these paths, linking two great centers in a shared ceremonial economy. Ideas in the water, ritual and symbolic exchange. Trade wasn't limited to objects, ideas traveled too. Across the Mississippian world, from Cahokia to Etowah to Moundville, we see recurring religious symbols. The hand with eye motif. The forked eye surround, associated with falcons or raptors. The serpent or horned serpent imagery. The cross and circle, symbolizing the sacred four directions. These repeated elements suggest a shared religious or mythological system, sometimes referred to by scholars as the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, SECC. It's unclear whether this was a formalized religion or a set of interlocking traditions, but its presence across distant communities implies that the rivers carried more than goods, they carried beliefs, ritual protocols, and spiritual authority. Pilgrimage and ceremonial centers. Not everyone who arrived at Cahokia came to trade. Some may have come as pilgrims drawn by reputation, ritual obligation, or the promise of spiritual transformation. Major ceremonies, solstice festivals, or funerary events would have attracted visitors from hundreds of miles. Some may have come to witness, others to participate, still others to learn and carry back practices to their home villages. This flow of people helped spread Cahokian influence without conquest. A visiting pilgrim might return to a small village and reconstruct a simplified version of a mound, a plaza, or a wooden solar circle, embedding the prestige of Cahokia into distant lands. The limits of the network. Despite its reach, Cahokia's influence was not total. Some regions resisted its cultural gravity. Others adopted parts of its style but adapted it to local needs and traditions. and even within Cahokia, the network depended on fragile balances. The rivers that enabled trade could also flood and isolate. The goods that marked status could become common through overproduction. The ideas that unified could also provoke conflict when interpreted differently. This was a world of negotiation, not domination, and when Cahokia began to decline, its network did not vanish overnight. Instead, it receded, splintered, and gave rise to new regional centers, each inheriting part of the legacy. If a copper plate crosses 1,000 miles, how many stories does it carry with it? And when that trade route ends, where do the stories go? In the Mississippian world, power didn't travel by road, it floated. The rivers of eastern North America weren't just waterways. They were cultural conduits, routes along which not only copper and shells moved, but also rituals, languages, political systems, and worldviews. In this section, we continue our exploration of Cahokia's role in this vast, riverine network. We'll examine how its influence extended outward like ripples on water, how smaller communities adapted its practices, and how trade became a form of soft power binding peoples together without a single empire ever forming. But as we'll also see, these connections came with limits. The further Cahokia's culture spread, the more it changed and the more it risked dilution or resistance. Even power that flows must eventually slow. A network without an empire. When we talk about ancient networks, it's tempting to draw comparisons to empires. Rome, Egypt, the Aztecs. But Cahokia was not an empire, at least not in the traditional sense. There's no evidence that Cahokia dispatched armies, established colonies, or imposed tribute through force. Instead, its influence operated more like a cultural magnet. Neighboring communities adopted Cahokian practices: mound building, maize farming, solar calendars, copper ornamentation, not because they were conquered, but because Cahokia offered prestige and spiritual capital. To align with Cahokia meant access to goods, ideas, and perhaps most importantly, meaning. In a world without centralized religion or codified scripture, Cahokia became a symbolic center, a place where the universe felt organized and visible. Small towns and sacred borrowing. Surrounding Cahokia were dozens, perhaps hundreds of smaller communities. These were villages, hamlets, and mound centers, each with its own identity, yet connected to the great city through trade, kinship, and belief. Some of these places show clear signs of Cahokian influence. Small platform mounds oriented in the same cardinal directions. Ceremonial plazas that mirror Cahokia's own layout. Burial practices that echo the arrangement of elite tombs. Local wood henges built on a smaller scale. But there are also important differences. These communities weren't copying Cahokia like a blueprint. They were adapting its ideas to local landscapes, resources, and cultural norms. This process is known as glocalization, the blending of global, or in this case, continental trends with local traditions. It's a sign of influence, not control. Art as a carrier of ideology. Among the most powerful tools in the Mississippian network was art. Throughout the region, we find an artistic tradition rich in symbolism, particularly in the shell engravings, copper plates, stone carvings, and figurines unearthed from mounds. These objects often feature recurring motifs. The birdman or falcon warrior, associated with upper-world power and the sun. The underwater panther, a creature of the underworld and watery chaos. The sun's circle and cross, representing cosmological balance. War clubs, axes, and serpents, signifying strength, transformation, and protection. These weren't mere decorations. They were iconographic systems, part of a larger Mississippian worldview scholars sometimes call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, SECC. Many of these themes appear first, or at least most prominently, at Cahokia. As such, Cahokia served as a kind of ritual think tank, disseminating spiritual frameworks that took root and morphed across distant lands. Influence through ceremony. Cahokia's reach may also have come from its role as a ceremonial epicenter. Like Mecca or Delphi, Cahokia may have drawn people not for conquest or commerce alone, but for pilgrimage and participation in sacred events. Major rituals perhaps tied to solstices, harvests, or elite burials would have drawn thousands of visitors, some staying weeks or months before returning home. These events likely included feasts, during which food and goods were redistributed by elite hosts. Ritual games such as chunky, played with religious overtones. Initiations or vision quests, which could bind outsiders to Cahokia's spiritual system. Craft and exchange fairs, where trade was conducted alongside ritual observation. These gatherings served not only religious functions, but also diplomatic and political ones. Leaders could make alliances, renew obligations, and anchor distant communities to the central ritual system. The role of maize in tying it all together. Maize was more than food. It was a symbol of civilization, and its cultivation tied Mississippian societies together across hundreds of miles. The widespread adoption of maize farming allowed for surplus, which in turn enabled trade, specialization, and the construction of monumental works like mounds and plazas. It also created dependencies. Those with abundant maize could offer it during festivals or droughts, creating social leverage. Cahokia, located in the fertile American Bottom region, likely produced vast amounts of maize, enough not just to feed its own population, but to supply pilgrims and nearby communities. In a very real sense, Cahokia's grain was its influence, feeding both bodies and alliances. Tensions at the edges of the network. Yet influence has its limits. Not all communities welcomed Cahokia's ideas, and some may have resisted its cultural pull. Archaeological evidence suggests some regional centers avoided certain Cahokian symbols, or reinterpreted them to suit local values. In others, we see signs of violence, such as burned ceremonial structures or desecrated mounds, possible evidence of revolt, rivalry, or rejection. And as Cahokia's power waned in the 13th century, its network frayed. The supply of prestige goods slowed. Ceremonial alignment lost its authority. Formerly connected towns began to drift apart, emphasizing local traditions over regional unity. Trade continued, but its symbolic weight lessened. The great river network that once tied the continent together became just a web of water again. Was Cahokia a capital? Some scholars have speculated. Could Cahokia have been a capital in a loose Mississippian state? It's unlikely. There's no evidence of direct taxation, no formal bureaucracy, no standing army. Cahokia's influence was organic, not bureaucratic. It operated through prestige, ritual gravity, and economic magnetism. In this way, it more closely resembled a theocratic hub, a place where authority radiated, not through command, but through cosmic alignment and cultural adoption. And that may be its most remarkable trait, a city that governed not by force, but by meaning. But when meaning fades, what holds a network together? What keeps a people aligned when the rivers still flow, but the center no longer speaks? By the 1300s, the mighty web of rivers that had once pulsed with the traffic of canoes, trade goods, ritual knowledge, and spiritual symbolism had begun to quiet. The network that had linked Cahokia to distant towns, villages, and ceremonial centers across the Southeast and Midwest was fraying, thread by thread. Cahokia, the beating heart of the Mississippian world, was no longer drawing people to its plazas and mounds in the same numbers. Trade goods slowed, ceremonies diminished, and even the sacred calendars, once synchronized across hundreds of miles, began to fall out of alignment. In this final section, we trace the disintegration of the Mississippian network, explore what parts endured, and reflect on how the story of Cahokia's influence didn't end, it transformed. The erosion of a center. As we've seen in previous stories, multiple factors contributed to Cahokia's decline. Environmental degradation, from over-farming and deforestation. Flooding and climate change, particularly during the onset of the Little Ice Age. Social unrest, evidenced by the construction of defensive walls and changes in burial patterns. Spiritual collapse, as cosmological order so carefully built into calendars, ceremonies, and architecture began to unravel. These changes weakened not only Cahokia's internal structure, but also its ability to hold together the cultural and trade ties that had once extended far across the continent. As the city shrank and ceremonial construction ceased, neighboring communities looked elsewhere for leadership or began to emphasize their own localized traditions. The network loosened. Peripheral centers rise, then fade. While Cahokia faded, other mound centers continued to flourish for a time. Moundville, Alabama, developed a highly stratified society with its own elite burial customs and symbolic system. Etowah, Georgia, maintained trade in copper, shell, and effigy objects, including distinctive copper plates similar to those from Cahokia. Spiro, Oklahoma, became a ceremonial center of extraordinary artistry, producing some of the most intricate shell engravings in the Mississippian world. These centers were not direct successors to Cahokia, but they likely inherited and adapted elements of its ideological and ceremonial legacy. For a while, they carried the flame forward, each becoming a new node in a changing network. But without the gravitational pull of Cahokia, and facing their own challenges, these centers, too, would eventually decline. By the time Europeans began exploring the interior of North America in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Mississippian world had become decentralized, its monumental cities abandoned, its rivers flowing past quiet mounds and forgotten earthworks. The river carries memory. Yet the collapse of Cahokia's network didn't erase its impact. Instead, its cultural DNA spread like sediment downriver. Trade items from Cahokia continued to circulate, sometimes for generations, as heirlooms and ritual objects. Mound-building traditions persisted, especially in the southeast, albeit on a reduced scale. Iconographic systems, falcons, cross and circle motifs, supernatural beings remained in use, though they morphed in meaning and style. Oral traditions likely preserved echoes of Cahokia's stories, rituals, and moral frameworks, even if names and places changed. Many indigenous nations today, including the Osage, Quapaw, Chickasaw, and Choctaw, trace cultural and ancestral roots to the Mississippian world. The rivers that once brought copper and shell now carry ancestral memory, a less tangible, but no less vital cargo. Continuity and fragmentation. Even after the ceremonial centers disappeared, the people remained. Mississippian descendants adjusted to new realities, integrating some practices while discarding others. Some changes were forced. Disease and violence brought by Europeans would alter the continent irrevocably. But Cahokia's descendants did not vanish. They became farmers, diplomats, warriors, storytellers, some forming new alliances and nations, others adapting under pressure. And remnants of the old network survived in subtle, resilient forms. River crossings that once linked trade routes became villages and towns. Burial practices retained cosmological meanings, even in Christianized communities. Craft traditions, such as shell carving and weaving, continued in new forms. Calendrical knowledge, reduced in scale, was passed on in seasonal practices, songs, and ceremonial dances. The Mississippian network had dissolved, but its currents still flowed beneath the surface. The rediscovery and reconnection. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, settlers, farmers, and archaeologists began uncovering the remnants of the Mississippian world. Mounds long considered natural hills were dug into, cataloged, or destroyed. Only slowly, and often wrongly, was the complexity of the Mississippian network recognized. Cahokia in particular was misunderstood for generations. Its trade goods were seen as curiosities, its alignments dismissed, its art labeled primitive. But today, that view is changing. We now understand that the Mississippian network was a sophisticated, adaptive, and expansive system, unmatched in pre-Columbian North America. And crucially, indigenous communities are reclaiming that heritage not just as distant history, but as living culture. The rivers that once carried trade now carry reconnection, as tribes work to preserve language, ceremony, and sacred sites. The network never truly died. It went underground, and now it rises again like a spring emerging from deep soil. Lessons from a network without walls. Cahokia and its river-bound world remind us that influence can spread without conquest. Power can be exercised through ritual, generosity, and belief. Trade and connection are not only about economics, but about meaning. Networks built on culture and ceremony can bind people across great distances. And when those networks break, what remains the echoes, the mounds, the motifs, the stories still matter. Because memory, like water, finds its way. How do you measure a network that left no roads, no documents, no monuments of stone? Perhaps you look for the silence between the rivers, the symbols shared between peoples, or the feeling still felt by some today that the land once spoke in unison. Story 5, Monk's Mound, earthwork empire at its peak. It rises slowly from the flat landscape, massive yet strangely quiet, as though it's waiting to be remembered. Covered in grass, layered in earth, Monk's Mound does not draw the eye like the pyramids of Giza or the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, but it is no less impressive. It is a testament to human labor, to vision, to ritual, and to a kind of authority not written down but built, basket by basket. Standing 100 feet tall and covering more than 14 acres at its base, Monk's Mound is the largest earthen structure in the Western Hemisphere. It is the crown of Cahokia, the city's ceremonial, political, and spiritual heart. For centuries, it stood at the center of the Mississippian world, its broad terraces rising in geometric harmony above the central plaza, watching over thousands of homes, dozens of smaller mounds, and the ever-flowing Mississippi. In this story, we focus entirely on Monk's Mound itself, its construction, meaning, function, and legacy. How was such a structure built without metal tools, beasts of burden, or written plans? What did it mean to the people who lived beneath it? And what does it still whisper to us today, from beneath its cloak of soil? A name from the wrong people. Before we explore what Monk's Mound was, we must acknowledge what it was not. The name Monk's Mound comes not from its builders, but from Trappist monks who briefly lived nearby in the early 1800s. These French settlers farmed the land, and like many Europeans of their time, failed to recognize the mound as indigenous in origin. They gave it a name that stuck, a name now enshrined in historical texts, maps, and museums. We do not know what the builders of Cahokia called the mound. No writing survives. But given its function, its alignment, and its place in the landscape, it was almost certainly regarded as sacred ground, a place where the worlds of humans and spirits met. Built by basket, the immensity of the task. At first glance, the sheer scale of Monk's Mound seems impossible for a society without draft animals, iron tools, or wheeled carts. But it was built nonetheless entirely by human hands, using woven baskets to move earth. Archaeologists estimate that over 15 million basket loads of soil were carried to create the mound. Each load, weighing around 50 pounds, was dug from nearby pits, often several types of soil selected for texture, drainage, and stability, and layered with deliberate care. Different colors and densities of soil were placed in patterned sequences, suggesting not just utility, but ritual meaning. This wasn't a single, sustained construction. Monk's Mound was built in at least 10 distinct stages, expanding and reshaping over time. Each new phase added terraces, stairways, or platforms, suggesting that the mound grew along with Cahokia's political and religious ambitions. Building such a structure required not only physical labor but social coordination. Someone planned each layer. Someone directed the labor force. Someone decided when and how to modify the shape. This implies a society capable of mobilizing thousands, not through coercion alone, but through shared belief. Engineering without blueprints. Monk's Mound is more than a pile of dirt. It is a carefully engineered construction, designed to resist erosion, drain rainwater, and support heavy structures. Its sides were sloped to prevent collapse. Drainage channels were likely incorporated into the design. The layers of clay and sand, alternating for strength and stability, suggest generations of trial-and-error engineering. Archaeologists believe the top of the mound once supported a large structure, possibly a temple, a council house, or the home of the ruler-priest. Post-hole patterns suggest a massive building, visible for miles, where religious rituals and political decisions were made. This building is long gone, made of wood and lost to time. But the mound beneath remains, a silent platform that once held the center of a civilization. Terraces and movement, ritual pathways. Unlike a simple pyramid, Monk's Mound was built in terrace levels, creating not just height, but staged progression. To ascend the mound, one would have climbed a grand staircase reconstructed today on the south side, likely lined with symbolic markers, banners, or carved posts. The ascent was not just physical, it was spiritual and political. Each terrace may have represented a different realm: the earth below, the world of humans, and the sky above. Reaching the top may have symbolized entering the realm of ancestors or spirits. Only the chosen priests, rulers, envoys were likely permitted to climb to the summit, reinforcing the hierarchy embedded into the very landscape. Movement around the mound mattered. Ceremonial processions, seasonal gatherings, and public performances would have centered on this structure. Even where you stood in relation to Monk's Mound, east, west, above, below likely held meaning. Orientation and sacred space. Monk's Mound, like the rest of Cahokia, was not placed randomly. Its orientation is closely tied to cardinal directions, especially east, aligning it with the rising sun. This alignment may have reinforced cosmological beliefs. In many indigenous traditions, the east represents life, rebirth, and the origin of power. To have the city's central mound face this direction was to place Cahokia within a sacred geography where daily and yearly cycles affirmed divine order. The surrounding mounds, plazas, and even distant Woodhenge were laid out in accordance with these same principles. This suggests that Cahokia's builders understood astronomical cycles, and that architecture was used to reflect and reinforce cosmic truths. A city watching itself. Monk's Mound wasn't isolated. It was part of a carefully constructed cityscape, with plazas spreading out below it, residential neighborhoods nearby, and other mounds positioned in patterns that may have mirrored celestial constellations or ritual routes. From the summit, a ruler could look out across the plaza, perhaps filled with people during a ceremony, and see the order they maintained. In turn, the people could look up and see their leader elevated, literally and symbolically above them. This visual hierarchy wasn't accidental. It was designed to instill awe, obedience, and belonging. The mound wasn't just a stage, it was a message written in earth. Mound as memory. We do not know who the first person was to climb Monk's Mound. We do not know the names of the architects or the laborers, but we know they must have seen this work as part of something greater than themselves. Mound building in indigenous North America was never just about construction. It was ceremonial, communal, and commemorative. Every basket of soil placed on Monk's Mound was an act of belief. an offering, a way of writing memory into the land itself. To stand atop it was to be part of that memory, to add to it. And even now, long after its summit building has disappeared, the mound remembers. What did they see, those who stood at the top? A city stretched beneath them, the rising sun aligned with the plaza. Or something more, a vision of order, of the world working as it should. At the summit of Monk's Mound, there once stood a structure long since vanished that may have housed the most powerful person in the Mississippian world. Whether this individual was a priest-king, a hereditary chief, or a spiritual intermediary, the place they stood was more than political. It was cosmological. It was ceremonial. It was the center. In this section, we descend from the physical structure of the mound into its symbolic weight. What did it mean to stand atop this artificial mountain? What kinds of ceremonies unfolded here? How did the people of Cahokia relate to it in daily life, and how did it shape their understanding of the world? Monk's Mound was not merely the largest construction in prehistoric North America. It was a stage of ritual, a mirror of belief, and a platform of control. The summit structure, house, temple, or throne. Though no remains of the summit building survive today, excavations at the top of Monk's Mound have uncovered post holes, evidence of a large, rectangular wooden structure, possibly up to 100 feet long. Based on the size, placement, and surrounding features, archaeologists believe it was likely a temple housing sacred icons and used for seasonal rituals, a residence for a paramount chief or ruler priest, or perhaps a combination of both, a political and spiritual headquarters. In Mississippian societies, the boundary between religion and governance was porous, if not non-existent. Rulers did not just wield secular authority. They often claimed a divine connection, representing the sun, ancestral spirits, or cosmological balance. To live atop Monk's Mound was to literally and symbolically rise above the rest of the world. Public ritual and the power of presence. Monk's Mound wasn't just a private retreat for the elite. It was a public focal point, visible from every corner of Cahokia's central precinct. From its summit, a speaker could project their voice across the plaza. Fires lit at night could be seen from distant neighborhoods. Ceremonial gestures, processions, or appearances from the top would have carried tremendous theatrical power. Imagine standing in the grand plaza during a solstice ceremony. Thousands gathered, the sun rising, and from the summit, a solitary figure appears in ceremonial regalia cloaked in feathers, beads, copper. He raises his arms, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in declaration. A hush falls. The presence of the ruler at that moment wasn't just personal, it was cosmic. He wasn't performing alone. He was mediating between worlds, sky and earth, ancestors and living, gods and humans. Monk's Mound was his altar, palace, and pulpit, all in one. Cosmological mapping, Earth as universe. The entire Cahokian landscape, with Monk's Mound at its heart, was designed to reflect a Mississippian cosmology divided into 3 layers. The upper world, the sky realm of the sun, moon, stars, and powerful bird-like spirits. The middle world, the terrestrial plane, human society, mounds, rivers, and fields. The lower world, the watery underworld, home to serpents, panthers, and ancestral forces. Monk's Mound, in this cosmology, bridged the layers. Its base sat on the earth, but its summit reached toward the heavens. Its carefully layered soil mirrored the layering of the universe, and the rituals performed upon it likely aimed to harmonize the realms to ensure balance, fertility, and order. The mound wasn't simply a construction, it was a cosmogram, a map of existence. Seasonal ceremonies and agricultural timekeeping. We know from Woodhenge and other alignments that Cahokia's people tracked solar cycles with precision. Monk's Mound likely played a central role in these calendrical events. Some scholars speculate that during the equinoxes or solstices, The rising or setting sun would align with specific points on the mound when viewed from across the plaza or from Woodhenge itself. These alignments would not only mark time, but also serve as ritual confirmations that the world remained in balance. Public rituals may have included planting festivals in spring, blessing the maize and honoring the sun. Harvest feasts in late summer or autumn, involving food redistribution. Rites of renewal at the winter solstice, when the sun began its return. Funerary ceremonies, especially for elites, whose burial near or within mound structures affirmed their cosmic role. Every ritual served to reaffirm the social order, which was also the cosmic order. Burials and ancestors, mounds as memory. Although Monk's Mound itself is not primarily a burial site, unlike some other mounds at Cahokia, its role as a sacred center would have been deeply connected to ancestral veneration. In Mississippian belief systems, the ancestors continued to influence the world of the living. They offered protection, guidance, and legitimacy. Rulers, particularly those claiming divine status, may have invoked ancestral spirits in ceremonies performed at the mound's summit. Other mounds nearby, such as Mound 72, contain elaborate burials, including the Birdman burial, surrounded by sacrificial victims and prestige goods. These burial sites, while separate from Monk's Mound, reinforce the mound's status as the ritual core of a society grounded in ancestry and cosmic cycles. The proximity of Monk's Mound to burial mounds suggests a sacred geography of the dead and the divine, with each space reinforcing the authority of the other. A living monument of social stratification. Monk's Mound did more than express religious or symbolic meaning. It structured daily life. Who lived closest to it? The elite. Their houses sat on smaller platform mounds, arranged neatly around the central plaza. Further out in neighborhoods and hamlets lived commoners, farmers, laborers, craft specialists. In this way, the mound itself embodied the social hierarchy. It was spatially reinforced. At the top, the ruler and the gods. Below, the elite and their ceremonial buildings. Beyond, the everyday lives of common people. Outside, the periphery less important, less visible, less sacred. This was no accident. Monk's Mound didn't just rise over the city, it organized it. A platform of fragility. For all its grandeur, Monk's Mound was not invulnerable. Soil shifts, heavy rains, and internal erosion created cracks in its structure, some of which still exist today. One side of the mound began to slump even during Cahokia's occupation, possibly leading to the collapse of the summit building at one point. This physical instability mirrors the eventual social and cosmological instability of the city itself. What happens when the structure, both literal and metaphorical, can no longer support its own weight? Perhaps the people of Cahokia saw the damage not just as an engineering problem, but as an omen, a warning, a signal that the balance had been lost. Did the last person to ascend Monk's Mound know it was the end? Did they look out over a city already shrinking, a plaza growing quiet, fields going fallow? Or did they, as always, raise their arms to the sky and wait for the sun to answer? Monk's Mound endures. While the wooden structures at its summit are long gone, while the priests and pilgrims have vanished, and while the songs once sung in its shadow are silent, the mound remains a presence, a shape, a question. Its weight is not just in earth, but in memory. It holds not only the story of its builders, but also the story of its unraveling. In this final section, we descend from the summit through centuries of abandonment, rediscovery, and reinterpretation toward the deeper meanings of what this artificial mountain tells us about power, belief, and time itself. The shrinking city below. By the 14th century, Cahokia was no longer the flourishing city it had once been. Neighborhoods emptied. The grand plaza grew quiet. The Woodhenge circles were left to rot, but Monk's Mound, massive and immovable, remained. The summit structure, whether house or temple, was likely dismantled or collapsed from disuse and weather. Its absence marked not just the end of occupation, but the fading of the rituals that had once animated the space. The elite, whose authority was tied to being seen atop the mound, were no longer visible. The platform that once symbolized cosmic order now stood disconnected, untended, no longer the center of anything but silence. And yet the mound was not destroyed. It was left intact. That in itself is significant. In many ancient cultures, when cities fall, monuments are toppled, burned, erased, defaced. But Monk's Mound remained, perhaps because the people who left still respected the sacred, even as the structure lost its function. Or perhaps it was simply too big to move. Whatever the reason, it stood while the world around it receded. Erosion, cracks, and collapse. Even the earth forgets. Over time, Monk's Mound suffered from within. Its enormous weight, combined with poor drainage and natural settling, caused slumping on its sides. The eastern face cracked, revealing layers of soil carefully packed centuries earlier. In one particularly telling episode, a large storm event may have caused a mudslide along the side of the mound during its occupation, possibly destroying the structure at the summit. Archaeological layers show abrupt rebuilding, suggesting a catastrophic failure followed by attempts to recover. Did the people of Cahokia see these as signs? The collapse of a temple could have been interpreted as a spiritual warning, an indication that the cosmic balance was broken. If the mountain made by hands could fail, what else might falter? Whether through practical erosion or symbolic interpretation, Monk's Mound began to lose its authority not just structurally, but socially. Abandonment and the return of the grass. After Cahokia was fully abandoned, likely by the mid-1300s, the landscape slowly reclaimed the city. Grass and trees took root. Winds softened the mound's edges. The grand stairways disappeared beneath soil and time. The carefully aligned geometry faded into irregular hills. To the people who remained in the region, the ancestors of tribes such as the Osage, Quapaw, Chickasaw, and Choctaw, the site remained known, but perhaps in different terms. Oral histories speak of ancient sacred places, powerful beings, and ancestral centers. The memory of Cahokia lived on, even if its name changed. But for others, the memory was lost entirely. Colonial misinterpretation. By the time European settlers arrived in the Mississippi Valley, Monk's Mound had become an enigma. Many refused to believe that native peoples could have constructed such a structure. It seemed too vast, too deliberate. And so arose the myth of the mound builders, a supposedly vanished ancient race of non-indigenous origin. Some speculated they were Phoenicians, or lost Israelites, or survivors of Atlantis. Anything, it seemed, but Native American. This erasure served a purpose. If the land had been shaped by a vanished people, then settlers could claim it without guilt. The mounds became artifacts of a forgotten civilization misused to justify colonial expansion. In this process, Monk's Mound was reduced from a sacred center to a curiosity. Visitors climbed it. Farmers plowed nearby. The stories beneath it remained buried. Excavation, recognition, and resistance. Serious archaeological work at Cahokia began in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Researchers mapped the site, documented mound structures, and began to piece together a picture of Mississippian civilization. Monk's Mound, because of its size, received special attention. Core samples revealed its layered construction. Surveys showed its alignment. Nearby digs uncovered artifacts, pottery shards, tools, and ceremonial items, each a fragment of a forgotten world. By the 1980s, the site was recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and Monk's Mound was acknowledged as one of the most remarkable feats of indigenous engineering in the ancient world. But recognition came with tension. For many native communities, these were not just archaeological sites, They were ancestral lands, burial grounds, and sacred spaces. Excavations risked violating spiritual laws. The act of digging into Monk's Mound was, for some, a desecration. And so a shift occurred. Archaeologists began working with indigenous communities, listening to their guidance, and adjusting methods accordingly. Today, much of Monk's Mound remains unexcavated, left in peace, as it should be. The mound today, a place of reflection. If you visit Monk's Mound now, you can climb a modern stairway to the summit. You'll see no buildings, no altars, no copper-plated priests, but you'll feel something, a weight, not of soil, but of time. You'll stand where thousands once gathered, where seasons were marked, where rituals aligned earth with sky. You'll look out and imagine a city where ritual and rule were one, where the mound wasn't just architecture, it was a worldview. And you might wonder, why don't more people know about this? Why in the story of America does the first true city, the largest monument, the sacred mountain of the Mississippi, still feel like a footnote? A final ascent. Monk's Mound was built by people who believed in something, not just in gods or leaders, but in the power of collective will. It was not a miracle. It was organization, tradition, repetition. Millions of baskets carried one at a time. The people who made Monk's Mound were not nameless savages. They were engineers, artists, planners, priests, parents, farmers. They were people of vision, living in a world as complex and rich as any other in human history. They built something meant to last not just in soil, but in spirit. And in that they succeeded. What do we owe to a mountain made of memory? What do we inherit from people who asked the earth to rise, and it did? Story 6. Agriculture of ambition, corn, beans, and city life. Cahokia was a city of tens of thousands, a feat of population density unmatched north of Mexico for nearly a millennium. Its plazas and mounds, markets and rituals, its calendar-keeping astronomers and mound-building laborers all required something simple but essential: food. Not just enough to survive, enough to thrive. In this story, we descend from the lofty mounds and ceremonial centers into the fields, gardens, storage pits, and kitchens of the Mississippian world. This is the story of agriculture, of the soil, the seeds, and the strategies that turned Cahokia from a regional center into a continental metropolis. Far from being an afterthought, agriculture was the foundation of the city's power. In the daily work of planting, weeding, storing, and redistributing food, Cahokia's social order was cultivated as surely as its corn. Before the corn, a landscape in transition. Long before maize dominated the diets of Cahokians, the peoples of the eastern woodlands relied on a mix of hunting, gathering, and small-scale cultivation. Nut trees, especially oak and hickory, were critical. So were wild greens, berries, squash, and a group of plants known as the Eastern Agricultural Complex. This native complex included maygrass, little barley, knotweed, lamb's quarters, sunflowers. These plants, domesticated by indigenous peoples thousands of years ago, were adapted to local soils and climates. They provided starch, oil, and protein, and they could be stored through the winter. For millennia, they formed the agricultural backbone of the region. But around 800–900 CE, something changed. A new crop from Mesoamerica was becoming dominant. That crop was maize. The maize revolution. Maize had reached the Midwest centuries earlier, but it took time before it became the staple crop. Early varieties were small and low-yield, requiring careful tending. But through centuries of adaptation, indigenous farmers in the Mississippi Valley developed hardier strains capable of supporting large populations. By the time Cahokia emerged as a city around 1050 CE, maize had become the primary food source. It was a transformative shift. Maize offered high yields per acre. It could be dried and stored for years. It supported dense, sedentary populations. And it enabled social stratification, because surplus could be controlled and redistributed. Without maize, Cahokia could not have existed. The labor of the fields, who grew the food that fed the city. Primarily, it was women. In many indigenous societies of the eastern woodlands, women controlled agriculture and food production, while men focused on hunting, diplomacy, and ritual warfare. Fields were cleared near riverbanks and on elevated ridges, where flooding was less likely. Crops were planted using the Three Sisters method. Maize, which provided a tall stalk. Beans, which climbed the stalk and added nitrogen to the soil. Squash, which spread across the ground, suppressing weeds and retaining moisture. This intercropping system was ingenious, both ecologically sustainable and nutritionally balanced. Fields near Cahokia would have formed a patchwork of cultivated zones, with villages and hamlets spread across the countryside. These rural communities supplied the urban core with food, while likely receiving protection, goods, and ritual access in return. Storage and surplus, feeding the city year-round. Feeding a population of 15,000 people required more than just good harvests. It required storage systems and social systems to manage food year-round. In archaeological sites around Cahokia, researchers have found subterranean storage pits lined with clay used for dried maize and squash. Communal granaries, likely controlled by elites. Hearths and food processing areas, often with layers of charred corn remains. The existence of centralized food storage points to an economic hierarchy. Elites collected surplus, possibly as tribute, and redistributed it during ritual events or times of need. This control over surplus wasn't just economic, it was political power. It allowed leaders to organize labor, host large feasts, and provide for people during lean seasons, reinforcing loyalty and authority. In this way, agriculture was not just about calories, it was about command. Ritual feasting and food redistribution. Cahokia's economy wasn't capitalist. It was a ritual economy built on gift-giving, reciprocity, and status. Large-scale feasts played a key role. During seasonal ceremonies or political events, elites would sponsor public gatherings where roasted meats, stews, corn dishes, and fermented beverages were shared with hundreds or even thousands. These weren't just meals, they were performances of abundance. To host a feast was to display one's ability to command resources. To receive food was to accept a position within a hierarchy of obligation. Refuse pits from these gatherings are rich with deer and fish bones, especially from large species, shell fragments from freshwater mussels, carbonized corn cobs and seeds, shards of large serving vessels, many decorated and ritually broken after use. Each artifact is a fossil of a moment of generosity and of power. The city as a consuming body. We often think of cities as built environments of mounds and houses, palisades and plazas. But Cahokia was also a biological system, constantly consuming. Tons of food, processed and prepared daily. Fuel for cooking, primarily wood, contributing to regional deforestation. Water carried by hand in ceramic vessels. Labor, both skilled and unskilled, to harvest, process, and prepare food. In this way, Cahokia was not a static place, it was a living organism, one whose health depended on the smooth flow of agricultural production from miles around. If that flow was disrupted by drought, flooding, or social unrest, the city would feel the effects immediately. The limits of expansion. While maize enabled growth, it also created dependency. Unlike the diverse diet of foragers and early horticulturalists, a maize-heavy diet is low in certain nutrients, especially niacin, vitamin B3. Without proper preparation such as nixtamalization, a process involving soaking corn in an alkaline solution, used in Mesoamerica but not widely in Cahokia. Heavy maize consumption can lead to nutritional deficiencies like pellagra. Skeletal remains from Cahokia show signs of malnutrition and anemia, especially among lower-status individuals. These patterns suggest growing inequality, with elites likely having access to more varied diets, including game meats, fish, and exotic foods brought through trade. As the city grew, its reliance on maize made it more vulnerable to crop failure and environmental change. Agriculture had brought prosperity, but it had also created fragility. What happens when the fields no longer yield? What happens when the city that grew from maize begins to consume itself? From a distance, Cahokia's growth may seem miraculous, but up close, it was a machine powered not by steam or electricity, but by muscle, memory, and maize. The city's survival depended on a continuous supply of food, and its people developed sophisticated methods for producing, managing, and moving that food across a vast regional network. In this section, we move deeper into the mechanics of the Mississippian agricultural system, focusing on how the landscape was modified, how labor was organized, and how food made its way from field to hearth or temple. Farming in Cahokia was not simply subsistence. It was a system of scale, a machine of ambition, and at times, a fragile bargain with nature. Land and soil, cultivating the bottomlands. Cahokia was located in one of the most agriculturally productive regions of North America. The American bottom, a broad, fertile floodplain along the Mississippi River, near modern-day St. Louis. This environment provided alluvial soils rich in nutrients, natural levees and ridges, ideal for planting, backwater lakes and sloughs, perfect for fish and aquatic plants, a long growing season with access to summer rainfall. But this was also a dynamic and dangerous environment. Seasonal flooding, while beneficial for soil enrichment, also posed a threat to planted fields. In response, Mississippian farmers selected elevated areas and natural terraces to establish gardens and fields. The result was a mosaic landscape: wetland edges, upland ridges, managed forests, and cleared fields, each used for different forms of food production. This wasn't natural land. It was engineered over generations. Seasonal rhythms and agricultural calendars. Life in Cahokia followed the pulse of the seasons. Agricultural activities were organized around solar observations, many tracked through woodhen and other astronomical alignments. The farming year might have looked like this. Early spring, clearing fields, controlled burns, and preparing soil. Late spring, planting maize, beans, squash, and other staples. Summer, weeding, maintaining fields, foraging supplemental foods. Late summer to early fall, harvesting, drying, and storing crops. Winter, hunting, crafting tools, preparing for planting. This cycle wasn't simply practical, it was spiritual. Ceremonies likely marked each stage of growth, reinforcing the idea that farming wasn't just labor, it was cosmic participation. Farming was a dialogue with the sun, the rain, the ancestors. The calendar was sacred because survival depended on it. Organizing labor, fields of obligation. We don't know precisely how Cahokian agriculture was organized, but the scale of food required suggests a hierarchical labor system. Farming likely followed a pattern similar to other complex societies with elite control. Common households maintained their own garden plots, enough for basic subsistence. Communal fields, possibly managed by lineages, clans, or neighborhoods, provided bulk maize for storage and redistribution. Elite-controlled fields, near mound centers or ceremonial precincts, may have been worked seasonally by laborers called upon through obligation, tribute, or corvée, unpaid public labor. This meant that farming was not just physical work, it was a social expectation. Individuals were embedded in networks of reciprocity and duty. Some grew food for family. Others grew food for the gods, the chiefs, or the city itself. The city's survival relied on shared participation in seasonal labor, but also on someone making sure the system kept moving. Food logistics, transport without wheels. Cahokia had no carts, no wheels, and no beasts of burden. Moving food across the landscape relied entirely on human labor. The simplest and most likely transport methods included woven bags and netted carriers slung over the shoulders, pottery vessels carried on heads or by hand, basket sleds dragged across short distances, canoes used to move bulk goods along rivers and channels. Farmers from surrounding villages may have made regular journeys to the central city to deliver tribute or surplus. These goods would then be stored in large communal pits or redistributed during seasonal feasts and ceremonies. In this way, Cahokia functioned not unlike a modern capital. Resources flowed in, rituals and power flowed out. The role of fish, game, and foraged foods. While maize, beans, and squash formed the agricultural core, the Mississippian diet was diverse and resilient. Alongside farming, Cahokians relied heavily on fish, especially freshwater species like catfish, gar, and sunfish. Waterfowl, ducks, geese, and cranes hunted along wetlands. White-tailed deer, a major source of meat and hides. Mussels and shellfish, abundant in rivers and lakes. Wild plants, including hickory nuts, acorns, persimmons, and berries. These foods supplemented the diet and reduced risk in bad farming years. But they also provided prestige. Certain meats and delicacies were likely reserved for feasts or elites. Hunting, fishing, and foraging remained important both economically and culturally. The forest and river were not merely backdrops, they were living partners in the city's food web. Ceramic clues, the story in the pots. Much of what we know about Cahokia's food system comes from its ceramics. Cooking pots, storage jars, serving platters each tells a story. Key findings include large olla jars, used to store maize meal or stew. Flat-bottomed bowls, ideal for serving gruel or porridge. Decorated vessels, often associated with ritual feasting or burial offerings. Residue analysis, revealing traces of maize, squash, seeds, and even fermented beverages. These vessels show how food was prepared, shared, and consumed. They also reveal social distinctions. Elite burials often included higher quality ceramics, sometimes imported from distant regions. A simple pot might hold more than stew, it might hold the imprint of a feast, a status, a memory. Environmental pressure, fields against the forest. The growth of Cahokia put increasing pressure on its environment. Deforestation. Wood was needed for houses, fires, tools, and palisades. Forests around Cahokia were heavily harvested, altering ecosystems and reducing game populations. Soil exhaustion. Continuous maize planting depleted nutrients, and without crop rotation or fertilization, yields likely declined over time. Flood risk. As trees and grasses were cleared, erosion increased and seasonal floods became more destructive. Waste management. With more people came more refuse food waste, ash, human waste, all of which could pollute water sources or attract disease. The agricultural system was productive but also vulnerable. As the city expanded, the land pushed back. How long can a city ask the soil to give? When the balance between gift and demand tips, what cracks first? By the height of its power, Cahokia had become a marvel of social coordination, spiritual centrality, and agricultural output. Fields sprawled across the American bottom, feeding tens of thousands. Maize, beans, and squash filled storage pits. Ceremonial plazas and feasting grounds pulsed with seasonal abundance. But no system, no matter how elegant, escaped strain. This final section traces the slow unraveling of Cahokia's food system. Not a dramatic collapse, but a drawn-out, creeping disintegration of the careful balance that once sustained the city. What happens when abundance becomes dependence? When climate shifts, soils tire and labor grows reluctant. In the failure of the harvest, we glimpse the fragility beneath Cahokia's ambition. Climate trouble on the horizon. Around the 13th century, climatic conditions began to shift across the northern hemisphere. Known as the onset of the Little Ice Age, these changes brought cooler temperatures, increased rainfall and flooding, unpredictable growing seasons. For a society so deeply reliant on maize monoculture, this posed a serious challenge. Unlike the native Eastern agricultural complex, which offered crop diversity and resilience, maize needed warmth, a long frost-free season, and stable fields. Flooding of bottomland fields likely increased. Crops failed sporadically. Communities that once contributed food to Cahokia may have held more back for their own survival. The system that once produced surplus now struggled to meet demand. Signs in the soil, abandonment and decline. Archaeologists studying soil layers and pollen records near Cahokia have found evidence of agricultural abandonment. A reduction in maize pollen, indicating shrinking fields. The return of weedy species, suggesting fields lay fallow. Erosion deposits in lowlands, linked to land clearance and unmanaged flooding. Meanwhile, midden deposits, ancient trash pits, show changing diets. Deer and fish remain staples, but there's a decline in meat diversity and increased consumption of smaller, less preferred species. This suggests people were working harder to get less. At the same time, storage pits begin to disappear from domestic sites. Either people no longer had enough surplus to store, or the infrastructure of redistribution was breaking down. The food machine was slowing, and so was the city it fed. Social fracture and the disintegration of order. As the agricultural surplus diminished, so did the authority of the elite. Leaders who once hosted feasts and coordinated planting cycles suddenly struggled to provide. Ceremonial centers were abandoned or scaled down. The ritual calendar unraveled. The shared purpose that tied rural and urban communities together began to fray. Without food to redistribute, elites lost legitimacy. Without regular ceremonies, social cohesion weakened. And as public work ceased, so too did the belief that the city remained under spiritual favor. Rituals that once tied soil to cosmos now rang hollow. The monumental promise of abundance had become a memory. The rise of conflict, or quiet departure. There is limited direct evidence of widespread warfare or violent collapse in Cahokia. Palisades were reinforced in the later period, and some human remains show signs of trauma, but this doesn't point to outright civil war or invasion. More likely, the collapse came in waves of migration, withdrawal, and disillusionment. Some people may have moved to more reliable agricultural lands further south. Others may have joined smaller, more sustainable communities beyond the city's shadow. Social groups fragmented along clan, lineage, or regional lines, breaking the centralized hold of Cahokia. Rather than a dramatic fall, it was an evaporation. Fields grew wild, plazas emptied, fires went out in hearths once fed by distant harvests. The city that maize built quietly unraveled. Legacy in the landscape. Even in decline, agriculture left its marks. Burned out soil in once-rich floodplains. Altered forests, shaped by centuries of gathering and clearing. Abandoned hamlets, where once-tight food networks dissolved. Yet there was regeneration too. As humans retreated, nature reclaimed the rhythms. Wetlands returned, trees grew. The land healed slowly, unevenly, but surely. And in some ways, the echoes of Cahokia's agriculture live on. Modern farms in the American bottom still grow maize. The soil still remembers. but today's fields are tilled by machines, their harvests driven by markets, their labor anonymous. No feast rises to greet the sun. Food, power, and the lessons of fragility. Cahokia's agricultural legacy teaches us this. The power to feed is the power to rule. But it also teaches that food systems are not just technical, they are ecological, social, spiritual. When they work, they build cities. When they fail, they dissolve them. Cahokia's farmers were not nameless peasants. They were the engineers of empire, the keepers of cosmic cycles, and the silent laborers behind every ceremony. Their hands shaped a city that fed tens of thousands and sustained a worldview that rose, for a time, with the corn. We remember the mounds, but we live in the shadows of the fields. What does it mean to build a world on abundance when abundance can never last? And what do we carry forward, not in monuments, but in the seeds we still sow? Story 7. The Lost Sun Circles, Cahokia's wood hinges and timekeeping. At first glance, the rings of buried posts west of Monk's Mound might seem unremarkable, just dark stains in the soil, arranged in perfect circles. But these were once tall wooden poles, each standing like a sentinel in a precisely engineered pattern. Collectively, they formed what archaeologists have come to call woodhinge, a name evoking comparison to the stone circles of ancient Britain, and for good reason. Because woodhinge was not a structure, it was a cosmic instrument. In this story, we trace the sun circles of Cahokia, forgotten calendars etched into the earth and sky. These wooden monuments didn't house people or store grain. Instead, they measured time, marked solstices, and shaped the rhythms of ritual life in the city. To understand Cahokia's people, we must look not only to the ground but to the sun's path across the heavens and how they watched it, year after year, from a ring of poles, standing silently at dawn. Discovery in the soil. The story of woodhinge begins not in antiquity, but in 1961, when archaeologist Dr. Warren Witry was surveying land near Cahokia. During a dig just west of Monk's Mound, he noticed a series of evenly spaced post holes, forming a large circle over 400 feet in diameter. At first, it seemed like a curiosity, possibly a palisade or stockade. But as the pattern emerged, Witry realized it was something else entirely. The holes were too regularly spaced for defense. They had no associated dwellings or storage pits. And they formed a perfect circle, an unusual shape in Mississippian construction. What Witry had uncovered was a wooden observatory. Today, this reconstructed feature is known as Woodhinge I, but additional, larger rings, Woodhinge II, have since been discovered nearby, each reflecting phases of construction over decades or centuries. An ancient calendar. Woodhinge worked like a solar calendar. At the center of the ring stood a tall post called the Central Observation Post. Around the circumference, other poles were placed to mark solar events, especially the summer and winter solstices, the spring and autumn equinoxes, and possibly important festivals tied to planting and harvesting cycles. On specific mornings, as the sun rose, it would align with particular outer posts when viewed from the central point. This allowed Cahokia's astronomer priests to track the solar year with precision. It was not a guesswork system. It was empirical, tested, and refined over time. Imagine standing at the center of the circle on the morning of the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. As the sun finally rises, it does so between two designated posts on the eastern horizon. The day's light is returning. The cycle is beginning again. This is more than astronomy. It is ceremony, reassurance, and control. The builders of time. Who constructed these rings? Likely, it was specialized laborers working under religious authorities. Erecting a woodhinge would have required careful surveying and mathematical planning. Clearing the land, perhaps ritual cleansing before construction. Setting post holes with measured precision. erecting tall red cedar poles, likely carried by hand or sled. The choice of red cedar was symbolic. It's a sacred wood in many Native American traditions, associated with the upper world, purification, and spiritual protection. Once completed, the ring stood open to the sky, enduring weather, seasons, and the gaze of those seeking meaning in the movements above. This was not merely practical, it was spiritual architecture, cosmic order and social harmony. Why build a solar calendar? Because agricultural societies depend on time. Knowing when to plant, when to prepare, and when to expect seasonal changes could make the difference between survival and hunger. But Woodhenge was not just about food. It helped enforce social and cosmic order. It provided fixed dates for ceremonies and rituals. It confirmed the authority of priestly classes, who read the sun and organized the calendar. It reassured the people that the world was in balance, that the sun still moved as expected, and that life would go on. In this way, Woodhenge turned astronomy into theology. The sky became a book, and the poles were its grammar. Communal gatherings at dawn. Woodhenge wasn't just used by astronomers. It likely hosted communal gatherings, especially at key seasonal moments. Imagine a chilly morning at dawn, the sky streaked with red. Hundreds gather in silence. At the center, a priest stands beside the observation post. All eyes are on the horizon. The sun rises, and its light pierces the gap between two posts. A murmur spreads. The priest raises his arms. Perhaps it's time to begin planting. Perhaps it's the start of a festival. Perhaps it's a day for feasting or fasting. In that moment, nature and society are aligned. Time has spoken. Woodhenge provided not just structure, but rhythm, a shared understanding of the flow of time, binding thousands into a single cosmic story. Disappearance and rediscovery. Like much of Cahokia, Woodhenge eventually fell into disuse. The poles decayed or were removed. The rings became invisible beneath the soil. The rituals they governed were forgotten or replaced. For centuries, there was no visible trace of these calendars. Only with modern archaeology and careful excavation did they re-emerge, not as standing monuments, but as ghosts in the dirt. And yet, their rediscovery reminds us that Cahokia was a city built as much on ideas as on earth. It's easy to admire mounds. They tower and impress. But these circles, ephemeral, precise, spiritual, tell a quieter story of a people who watched the sky, marked the days, and made meaning from the turning of the sun. What do we lose when we no longer know what time it is? And what ancient rhythm still beats, quiet and buried, beneath our modern clocks? Standing inside a reconstructed Woodhenge, one feels a curious pull, a sense of being suspended between earth and sky. No walls enclose the space. No roof shields it. And yet there is structure, the quiet geometry of poles and shadows designed to give meaning to the movements of light. This section explores how Cahokians built these sacred circles not just physically, but conceptually. It is a story of engineering without blueprints, astronomy without telescopes, and cosmology without clocks. The Woodhenges were not just monuments, they were instruments of alignment, marrying the mathematical with the mythic. To understand them is to enter a world where time was seen, not heard, and where the sun wrote truth across the morning sky. Laying the circle, math by memory. There is no evidence Cahokians used writing or numerals as we know them. Yet, they constructed circles up to 400 feet in diameter, placing as many as 72 posts with astonishing regularity. This would have required knowledge of central points and radii, even angular spacing, true cardinal directions, geometric principles of symmetry. So how was it done? Likely through measured packing, cord lengths, and sighting poles. Using ropes of fixed length, workers could mark equal distances, drawing arcs into the soil before placing posts. Tools like the gnomon, a simple vertical stick casting a shadow, could help establish true north, from which other directions could be calculated by solar movement. What's remarkable is that these were oral engineers, no blueprints, just technique, memory, and repetition passed down over generations. It worked. Even today, when overlaid with modern survey maps, the post holes form nearly perfect circles, deviating by only a few feet across hundreds. Layered calendars, evolution over time. Archaeologists have discovered multiple wood hinges at Cahokia, labeled wood hinge I through V. Each differs slightly in diameter, number of posts, and location. This tells us the wood hinge concept was iterative, developed, refined, and rebuilt over time, likely reflecting changes in leadership, shifting ritual needs, advancements in solar tracking. The earliest ring, wood hinge I, had 28 posts, possibly marking key lunar or monthly intervals. Later rings expanded to 48, 60, or even 72 posts, suggesting more complex calendrical tracking. Some scholars believe these rings worked like rotating dials, with specific posts corresponding to important festivals or agricultural dates. Others argue that only a few key alignments mattered, like the solstices, and the rest were structural or symbolic. Regardless, each ring shows intentional design, not random construction. The builders were watching the sky, then building on the earth what they saw above. Alignments and interpretations. The most well-studied wood hinge alignments include winter solstice sunrise. The sun rises at its southernmost point, aligning with a designated post. Summer solstice sunrise. Rising at its northernmost point, the sun marks the longest day. Equinoxes. At spring and fall, the sun rises due east, balance between extremes. Cross-quarter days. Midpoints between solstice and equinox, possibly tied to planting or harvest festivals. Other potential alignments include moonrise tracking. Some posts may reflect major lunar standstills, occurring every 18.6 years. Star alignments. Though speculative, some patterns may match the rising of certain bright stars important to regional cosmology. This is speculative, but it suggests that wood hinge was part of a broader cosmological system, tuned not just to one celestial event, but to a full calendar of the sacred. Echoes of the cosmos in the ground. Wood hinge wasn't alone. Across North America, indigenous cultures used circular constructions to track the heavens. The Bighorn medicine wheel in Wyoming aligns with solstices and heliacal star risings. Hopewell circles in Ohio, centuries earlier, show precise solar and lunar geometry. Puebloan sun dagger marks solstices via light and shadow in Chaco Canyon. Cahokia's wood hen joins this broader tradition, proof that ancient North American peoples were keen observers of the sky, building calendars from careful watching and cultural memory, not speculation. What's distinctive at Cahokia is the scale and integration. These solar circles were not isolated, they stood beside mounds, plazas, and neighborhoods, forming part of the living urban fabric. Timekeeping wasn't hidden, it was public, performative, and sacred. Reconstructing the instrument. In the 1980s, archaeologists and indigenous consultants helped reconstruct wood hinge III on its original site. Using old post holes, they rebuilt the circle with tall red cedar poles, placing the central sighting post and solstice markers. Today, visitors can stand at its center, just as Cahokians once did. Each year, people gather at dawn for winter and summer solstice events, watching the sun rise through the posts just as it did 900 years ago. The rituals are different now, of course. There are jackets, cameras, coffee. But the feeling, the hush before dawn, the tilt of the earth announcing itself in golden light, that remains the same. You're not just watching the sun, you're watching a memory rise. What happens when a society builds its time not in gears, but in shadows. When the year is marked not by paper or pixels, but by where the sun finds you standing. As the final section of this story opens, the sun once again crests the horizon, but the crowd is gone. The ritual leaders are silent. The cedar poles rot quietly into the earth. Time still moves, but the rituals to measure it have ceased. This is the story not only of how Cahokia's wood hinges were built and used, but how they faded from memory, and what that fading tells us about how people lose their hold on time itself. In this concluding part, we examine the meaning of abandonment, the echoes of timekeeping in later cultures, and how memory, like a sunrise, can vanish behind clouds only to return, centuries later, in a beam of rediscovery. When the circle breaks, we do not know precisely when Cahokia's wood hinges fell out of use, but archaeology suggests that by the mid to late 1200s, less than 2 centuries after their first construction, the solar rings were no longer maintained. Some key signs of this decline: post holes left unfilled, allowing poles to fall and rot. No rebuilding of rings after storms or environmental changes. A shift in ceremonial focus, away from the western precincts where the circles stood. These changes coincide with the broader decline of Cahokia, its population shrinking, mounds abandoned, and monumental efforts ceasing. In the absence of ritual observances, the poles lost meaning, and without the community to witness the sun's alignment, the calendar unraveled. Time didn't stop, but the system for organizing time socially, cosmically, spiritually collapsed. The sacred became ordinary, then it became forgotten. What happens when you lose your calendar? The implications of Woodhenge's disappearance are more than astronomical. Calendars are not just about marking days, they are about binding communities to shared rhythms, coordinating labor, ritual, and memory, aligning human time with cosmic time. When the calendar breaks, so does the consensus on when to plant, when to feast, when to mourn. Social coordination becomes uncertain, leadership falters, traditions fragment. In Cahokia, the end of Woodhenge meant the end of a cosmology that wove sky, soil, and society together. It may not have caused the city's decline, but it mirrored it. A civilization that could no longer track the heavens was a civilization losing its direction on Earth. Echoes in other cultures. Though Woodhenge vanished, its core function, the ritual structuring of time, persisted in other indigenous cultures. The Natchez of the lower Mississippi Valley, 18th century, had a sun king, with elaborate seasonal festivals and solar symbols in governance. Puebloan peoples of the Southwest used sun daggers and horizon markers well into the modern era. Southeastern mound building traditions retained seasonal ceremonialism, though often without monumental solar observatories. Even without circular rings or cedar posts, the ritual measurement of time survived through oral calendars, dances, and the alignment of community events to celestial markers. The tools changed, the relationship endured. Rediscovery and the return of the rings. For centuries after Cahokia was abandoned, the site lay silent. Farmers plowed the fields, settlers passed through. Few knew they walked over the remains of an ancient city, or that beneath their feet lay buried calendars, carefully laid out by people who had once stood at dawn, watching the sun rise in ceremony. It wasn't until the 20th century that archaeology began to piece together Cahokia's scale and sophistication. The Woodhenge rings, invisible from above, were revealed only through soil discoloration, detected by trained eyes and methodical digging. When the Woodhenge posts were reconstructed in the 1980s, they did not resurrect the original religion or calendar, but they did offer a place of reflection, where the ancient relationship between sun, time, and society could be felt once again. Today, visitors to Cahokia gather on the solstices at sunrise not to invoke the gods, but to witness what the people of the past once saw. To imagine what it meant to stand there, arms folded against the cold, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the light to pass between the sacred posts. It is, in its way, a rejoining of the circle. Time as monument. The mounds of Cahokia are built of soil, the wood hinges of wood and shadow, but both are monuments to time. The mounds mark it in layers, generations of construction, centuries of labor. The wood hinge marks it in moments, single sunrises, brief flickers of alignment, precious as breath. Together, they remind us that humans have always sought to do the impossible, to hold time still, to mark it, to align ourselves with forces vast and ancient. At Cahokia, they nearly succeeded. And so the question lingers, quiet as the dawn. What rings are we building, invisible in our cities, to measure the time that defines us? What sunrises will our descendants try to remember? Story 8. The River Road Trade, Travel, and the Mississippi Highway. If you had stood at the edge of Cahokia in its heyday and looked westward, beyond the city's mounds and the maize fields, you would have seen something larger than any monument and more important than any plaza: the Mississippi River. Wide, slow-moving, and seemingly eternal, it was not just a body of water. It was the artery of a continent. Long before roads crisscrossed North America, before trains, before wagons, there was the river. And Cahokia sat beside one of its busiest junctions not by accident, but by design. In this story, we explore the waterborne networks that sustained Cahokia. We trace the roots of trade and communication that flowed like currents themselves, connecting villages, cities, and distant cultures across thousands of miles. This was the River Road, and it ran not through the land, but along the veins of the earth. Geography as opportunity. Cahokia's location was no coincidence. It occupied a strategic position in the American bottom, a wide, fertile floodplain just east of the confluence of the Mississippi, Missouri, and Illinois rivers. This confluence made Cahokia a natural hub. From here, travelers and traders could reach the Great Lakes to the north via the Illinois River, the Gulf of Mexico to the south via the Mississippi, the Great Plains to the west via the Missouri River, the Appalachians and beyond via eastern tributaries. No wheeled carts, no pack animals, just dugout canoes carved from hollowed logs gliding silently across the waters. For a society without beasts of burden, water was freedom. The river was the road, and Cahokia was its rest stop, capital, and marketplace all at once. Goods in motion. Archaeological evidence reveals a stunning array of goods flowing into and out of Cahokia. From distant regions came copper from the Great Lakes, mica from the Appalachian foothills, marine shells from the Gulf Coast, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, chert flint from the Ozarks and Tennessee Valley, grizzly bear teeth, rare stones, carved pipes, pigments, and ceremonial items. In return, Cahokia likely exported maize and foodstuffs, crafted shell and stone tools, ceramics with distinct Cahokian styles, religious or symbolic items linked to its cultural authority. These were not just items of barter, they were vectors of ideas, beliefs, and styles. Each object carried with it a whisper of a distant land, and Cahokia stood at the center of this whispering web. Networks of exchange. Cahokia did not control this trade like an empire with armies. There were no tolls, no borders as we know them. Instead, the trade networks were based on kinship, diplomacy, ceremony, and seasonal migration. Some exchanges were likely. Gift economies used to build alliances. Ceremonial exchanges, as part of spiritual or cosmological relationships. Reciprocal trade, where goods moved slowly over generations, each handoff a story. Trade routes were not simply economic, they were social highways, maintained through ritual obligation and mutual benefit. Along these routes, people also moved. Ideas such as mound building techniques or religious symbols. Languages and dialects. Stories, myths, and news of distant lands. In this way, Cahokia was not isolated, but deeply embedded in a North American system of exchange that stretched across ecological zones and cultural boundaries. The canoe, silent workhorse of the river. The real hero of this story is not a king or a priest, it is the canoe. Built from hollowed logs, these vessels were shaped using fire and stone tools, carefully scraped, smoothed, and sealed. They could be small and personal or large enough to carry several passengers and cargo. A skilled canoeist could navigate both open rivers and tight marshes, using current and backwater channels to reach destinations quietly and efficiently. Unlike overland transport, which was exhausting and slow, river travel allowed for bulk transport of goods, long-distance communication, seasonal movements between base villages and ceremonial centers. To live along the river was to live in motion. Ceremonial travelers and pilgrims. Trade was not the only reason people traveled to Cahokia. Many likely came as pilgrims or visitors during major ceremonial events. Imagine a group from the lower Mississippi Delta paddling north for weeks to bring offerings to Monk's Mound. Traders from the northern forests exchanging gifts at equinox festivals. Delegations of priests, dancers, and musicians making the journey by water, guided by sun and shoreline. The river made this possible, and Cahokia, with its open plazas, massive mounds, and cosmological layout, may have been seen as a sacred destination, a place to see and be seen. The Mississippi was more than a highway. It was a path to the spiritual heart of the continent. What the river remembers. Today, the Mississippi River is crowded with barges, bridges, and industrial ports. But beneath that modern skin, it remains the same waterway that once carried copper from Lake Superior and shells from the Gulf. It still flows past Cahokia's remains. No log canoes, no baskets of trade goods, just mud, current, and the memory of motion. It is a quiet memory, but one that still shapes the land. When the road is water, what stories are told in the ripples? And when the current changes, how do the cities beside it endure? The river brought people to Cahokia, but what did they find when they arrived? Not just a market of stalls and goods, but a ceremonial economy, one where trade, religion, and diplomacy were inseparable. This section explores the cultural mechanics of exchange at Cahokia. It dives into what happened when people met at the city, what they brought, what they left behind, and how these interactions shaped the political and spiritual power of the metropolis. The Mississippi was the road, but Cahokia was the crossroads, a place where the physical act of trading became a sacred negotiation of identity, memory, and meaning. Marketplace without merchants. There is no firm archaeological evidence of a market district at Cahokia, as we might imagine it. No rows of shops, no coins, no fixed stalls. Instead, evidence suggests that exchange was woven into daily life and likely occurred in plazas, around mound complexes, or during public gatherings. In a non-monetized economy like Cahokia's, trade was rarely impersonal. It was part of ritual obligation, feasting and redistribution, gift-giving diplomacy. Many exchanges would have occurred during seasonal festivals, where thousands gathered in and around Cahokia for planting, harvesting, or solstice rituals. These events offered both spiritual and practical opportunities to renew social ties, to exchange goods across regions, to participate in collective ceremonies. And so the city's plazas likely functioned as ceremonial markets, where the giving and receiving of goods was secondary to the reaffirmation of relationships. Feasts as economic engines. A cornerstone of Cahokian society was the communal feast. These were large, planned events, often tied to religious cycles, where leaders would distribute food and gifts. Feasts served multiple roles. They legitimized elite power, showing the leader's ability to provide. They redistributed surplus food, preventing hoarding or scarcity. They attracted distant communities, bringing people and their goods into the city. They set the stage for exchange. After feasting came gifting and trading. At these gatherings, a visitor from the Gulf Coast might offer shells in return for Cahokian copper beads. A delegation from the north might receive maize cakes in exchange for bear pelts. The feast was the social lubricant that made these exchanges possible. This wasn't just about survival. It was about maintaining a society without markets, using ritual and generosity in place of prices. Rituals of exchange, the sacred and the symbolic. Some items moving through Cahokia's trade network weren't useful at all, not in a practical sense. Instead, they were symbolically valuable. These included pipes carved from rare stone, used in ceremonial smoking. Figurines or effigies, representing spiritual beings or ancestors. Copper plates, often embossed with imagery from the southeastern ceremonial complex. Marine shell gorgets, worn as pendants and tied to cosmological meanings. These objects were often buried in mound complexes or elite tombs, suggesting they played roles in funerary and political rites. To trade such objects was not a transaction, it was a religious act, linking people across space and time in a shared spiritual economy. Cahokia's prominence in this network made it not just a political capital, but a ritual center, where power flowed from the ability to host, gift, and consecrate. Foreigners at the city's edge. Excavations at Cahokia have revealed diverse artifacts not locally produced, but also diverse people. Some burials contain teeth with isotope signatures from distant regions, foreign burial styles, unlike traditional Cahokian ones, grave goods from far-off areas. This suggests that outsiders lived in, visited, or were buried in Cahokia either as traders, pilgrims, or perhaps even as captives or diplomatic hostages. Ethnographic comparisons suggest some people may have lived in peripheral neighborhoods, tied to particular craft traditions or regional identities. Others may have come only seasonally. In this way, Cahokia may have functioned much like later indigenous gatherings at intertribal meeting grounds, temporarily diverse, ritually charged, and always in motion. The social cost of exchange. Trade brought benefits but also complex obligations. In Cahokia, giving was not just generous, it was strategic. If you gave someone a valuable gift, they were expected to return the favor eventually, and ideally with more. This created networks of debt, honor, and alliance. A single marine shell pendant might bind two leaders for life. Failure to reciprocate could lead to dishonor, exclusion, or conflict. So while there was no money, there was value, and the value lay in relationships. Cahokia's leaders didn't accumulate wealth in our sense. They accumulated people, favors, and memories. Changing tides, fatting flows. As Cahokia declined in the 1300s, so too did the flow of goods. Trade networks shifted. Other centers rose, perhaps more stable or better aligned with emerging rituals and politics. Without the feast, without the hosting, the pilgrims stopped coming. The river remained, but the reasons to paddle it changed. Goods still moved, but the hub lost its pull. And the rituals that had once bound objects to obligations, strangers to ceremonies, began to fade. Cahokia's markets, ceremonial, informal, relational, were gone. All that remained were scattered artifacts, their meaning lost, buried in the soil. When trade is not just exchange, but memory. What is lost when the goods remain, but the story is gone?